The Sheikh's Secret Son, the Sharjah Sheikhs Series, Book 3, written by Leslie North, narrated by Nicholas Thurkettle. Chapter 1. Welcome to Sharjah. Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi boomed as he stood, dressed in a traditional golden gown with white headpiece, his arms open as the members of the U.S. diplomatic tour entered the reception hall at the Sultan's palace. He'd long ago chosen the gold to set himself apart from his older brother Khalid, who always wore plain white, and Ahmed, his younger brother, who always wore tailored suits when meeting with foreign officials, as if to say he was one of them. Zaid was not one of them. He was proud of who he was and of the culture of his home. Zaid presented a warm smile to welcome his guests as they filed past members of the palace staff, who held the ornate wooden doors open for the government officials and business investors. The Sultan had long ago divided the various aspects of representing Sharjah in the best possible light. He'd assigned Zaid to overseeing and guiding government and business investors on their ventures through the Emirate of Sharjah, with the hope that they will choose to invest in Sharjah's growth. As the diplomatic envoy made their way into the room to stand in front of him, Sheikh Zaid delighted in seeing their eyes fill with awe as they took in the centuries-old palace with its original gilded walls and columns. Given how young their country is, most Americans have no idea what it's like to live amongst such history, as they gazed upon the priceless ancient art and sculptures lining the walls, all pieces from the Sultan's private collection. As the doors leading into the hall were closed, a lone member of the group lingered near the entrance, with her back to the room. Something about the short woman with wavy auburn hair seemed familiar, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Trying to ignore the woman who wasn't paying attention, he continued his welcoming speech. I am Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi, middle son of the Sultan bin Mohammed al-Qasimi, and I welcome you to Sharjah. For those of you who haven't been here before, I hope that you will have time to avail yourself of the many things we have to offer, from our museums and parks to our restaurants and markets. There is something here for everyone. The gentleman next to me is Alakabak Nuzu, chief advisor to the Sultan. Zaid gestured to the man who stood next to him in a white gown and headpiece with a tan robe draped over his shoulders. Alakabak stood a little shorter than Zaid, but he was still a broad and imposing figure with severe eyes and dark features. He wore his experience and political status well, commanding respect from those around him. Together we will see to your needs during your stay here in Sharjah. The Sultan will be down to join us momentarily, Zaid continued, still distracted by the woman now talking quietly on her cell phone. If you have any questions during your visit, or if there is anything you need, let one of us know. You are our guests, even if you are not staying at the palace. He lost focus on his welcome speech, nearly forgetting what came next, and jerked his gaze away from the woman in the back, forcing himself to look at the group of government officials and investors in front of him. Over the last several years, we have made tremendous progress here in Sharjah, as I'm sure you are all well aware, making great strides towards eliminating poverty and promoting growth in the private sector. We have done this by bringing major companies into the region to provide our citizens with better jobs and more opportunities for growth. We welcome you here today in an effort to continue that progress, he continued, struggling to keep his train of thought as his eyes drifted back to the woman on the phone. Maybe the Sultan's chief advisor would like to add something, he suggested to Alakabak, hoping he would take over before he completely lost his train of thought. Thankfully, Alakabak nodded his head in agreement as he stepped forward. Thank you, Sheikh Zaid. I want to thank you all for visiting Sharjah. We welcome new business opportunities and investments in our growing economy. You find us at a crossroads, where the past is connecting with the future in the Emirate of Sharjah, in all of the United Arab Emirates, really. We take the task of blending our traditions with the modern world seriously, something that will be evident as you move about our fair city. The woman in the back turned around, and Zaid finally caught a glimpse of her exquisite face. It was her. Despite the glorious time they'd spent together, the way they'd left things when they parted, he'd thought he would never see her again, but there she was. Rebecca Reed. He knew he shouldn't be surprised to see her amongst the group given her area of expertise, but suddenly seeing her took his breath away, and he wondered if she would be equally affected to see him. Trying to catch a glimpse of her left hand, he couldn't tell if she wore a ring, and he itched to stride across the room for a better look. Catching a quick shot of those sky-blue eyes took him back to the last time he'd seen her. He remembered the heat in those eyes as she'd looked into his, and the way they'd made him feel, somehow ravenous, as if only she could quench his hunger, and yet protective all at once. The last time he'd seen those eyes, the two of them stood face to face on the balcony behind her hotel room. It had been a magical night, and it ended under the stars. But their commitments to their respective positions had pulled them apart then, and he figured it might have been for the best. He couldn't tell if she had seen him yet, so he continued to watch her covertly. If anything, these years were good to her. She was more beautiful than he remembered. She'd always worn her hair in a tight bob, which suited her, but he was pleased to see that it was longer now, allowing her natural waves to frame her face. And I think Sheikh Zaid will agree when I say that there is still much work to be accomplished to get us where we want to be. Al-Kabak concluded his speech, bringing Zaid's attention back to the front of the room. Yes, he agreed without hesitation, there is still much work to be done. He didn't know where to go in his speech from there, too busy watching the auburn-haired beauty in the back of the room. It was as if she'd stepped directly out of his memory with her knee-length gray skirt hugging the subtle curves of her petite frame, her gray jacket clinging tightly to her shoulders and breasts, her silky hair, those thin hands that held his face to hers, and those blue eyes that had pulled him out of himself before. He forgot himself every time he saw her. I took the liberty of creating an itinerary that each of you should have received at the hotel when you arrived, Zaid continued. It illustrates for you the different parts of the region where we will be visiting. We want to show you the best that Sharjah has to offer and what your investments will be supporting. We tried to include a fair mixture of traditional sites and modern features. We can start your tour of the region today, after we take a brief break to get everyone situated and organized. Zaid had worked closely with Al-Kabak and the tourism advisors to create an itinerary filled with trips to the museum, the desert park and reserve, the finest restaurants, the new conference center, and a few sightseeing tours designed to show off the wealth and modern development prevalent in Sharjah. He figured he would show them everything he wanted them to know about Sharjah, things he couldn't put into words, in order to persuade the investors and government officials to put more money into business developments in the emirate. While he spoke, he looked for Rebecca again. She was gone, swallowed by the group. I'd like to close by saying again that we're glad you could visit the region and see what opportunities we have to offer your businesses and other investments in our economy, he concluded. Now, if you'd like, we have refreshments on the table behind me. Don't fill up on the finger foods, though, he said with a laugh. We will be attending lunch after a brief meet-and-greet session with the Sultan and other government officials who are now arriving. Zaid stepped aside from the tables of food as servers appeared with trays of non-alcoholic drinks. As the guests were distracted by the refreshments, he began to make his way through the group, looking for the beautiful American woman who had threatened to steal his heart all those years ago for just a few nights of passion. He hadn't given her much thought in the 5 years since, allowing the memory of her to fade into the busy political scenery. Ironically, it seemed she'd done that here in the palace. He couldn't find her anywhere. He heard Al-Kabak explaining some of the places they would be visiting to the guests behind him while he searched for Rebecca. Sheikh Zaid's heart pounded in his chest while he looked for Rebecca. There weren't very many people in the room, no more than a dozen members of the diplomatic tour with a few staff members serving drinks and food. Perhaps he hadn't actually seen her. Maybe he'd mistaken another guest for her in a fit of wishful thinking. He looked around to see if he could find the mistaken guest, but no one fit the description of the little American woman who was a foot shorter than he was without her heels on. In the meantime, his father, the Sultan, had finally joined the meeting. He sat in his large throne-like chair on the dais at the far end of the room. Khalid stood next to their father, both of them in their traditional gowns and headpieces, but the Sultan with his black robe with gold trim over his shoulders. Suddenly, there she was, walking toward the Sultan in her tight skirt, her thin legs tapering down to her heels. The perfect curve of her ass lured his eyes in as she moved. Her auburn hair showed off just enough of the porcelain-white skin of her neck to remind him of what the rest of her looked like beneath those clothes. It had been a long time since he'd seen her body, but he could still see her alabaster skin clearly in his mind's eye, the way it contrasted with dark, reddish skin of his hands as he ran his fingers down her back or across her stomach. He remembered burying his hands in her hair and holding her to him as they kissed the first time. So many emotions ran through him that by the time he caught up to her in front of his father's chair, he wasn't sure what he was going to say to her. He couldn't reveal too much to his traditional father, beyond the fact that they had worked closely together during one of his previous visits to the United States. He certainly couldn't bring up the past. Chapter 2. I love you. Good night and sweet dreams, kiddo. I love you too, Mommy. Rebecca had almost expected her son to hand the phone over to her sister, Amy, who was watching him while she was out of the country, but he went ahead and disconnected the call on his own. He could be so grown up sometimes. And at those times, it didn't make being away from him any easier. She stuffed her cell phone into the inner pocket of her jacket. While the rest of the group listened to the two representatives of the Sultan, she noticed that the Sultan himself had entered the room and was sitting in a large throne-like chair on a dais at the other end of the room. Instead of hanging around and listening to what the Sultan's tour guides had to say, she decided to go directly to the Sultan himself to see if the tour would include important sights instead of the tourist attractions that would surely gloss over the injustices committed daily in the emirate. The Sultan had a reputation abroad of not making as many concessions for foreigners as some of his neighbors did. She knew it was possible he wouldn't be forgiving of her forward behavior and attitude, but she still had a job to do while she was there. She made her way around the others in the group and past the tables of finger foods and the wait staff serving tea and coffee. She walked up to the Sultan and introduced herself. "Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi?" she asked, giving him her best smile before nodding to the man standing next to him, who gave her a friendly smile in return. The Sultan looked her up and down with a less than flattering expression on his face. "My name is Rebecca Reed. I'm the envoy to the diplomatic party visiting your emirate. I want to thank you for allowing us to visit," she continued. "We are glad to have you," the Sultan said with a sturdy, unaffected voice. She expected him to hold up his hand and tell her to kiss a ring. "We look forward to discussing further investments in the growth of Sharjah with you," he continued, "and I hope you find your accommodations fitting." The party had been put up in one of the nicest hotels in Sharjah, as requested by the head representative of the party, a feisty woman named Candace. So far, they'd been treated like royalty. "Yes, sir," Rebecca answered the Sultan. "We've been treated very well. Thank you." "Good," he said, obviously very pleased with himself. "I'm glad to hear it." "Yes, sir, but there is something I wanted to ask you about the tour," Rebecca continued. "Yes? How may I be of service?" She was surprised by the genuine sound of concern in his voice. "I was reviewing the itinerary we were given, and I noticed Rajak and Timina were missing. We're visiting just about every other part of Sharjah, but those two sections are left off. They're also two of the poorest sections of the emirate. I was wondering if we could visit them as well." "That part of town does not offer anything for the investors, which is why it was not included." She expected him to be angry, but his tone conveyed puzzlement as to why she would bring them up. "I think visiting those sections of Sharjah would give us the opportunity to address any labor concerns the investors may have," she assured him, hoping he would agree. The Sultan chuckled humorlessly. "Yes, if anything, it will show them that there is plenty of room for economic growth. But if you'd like to talk about visiting those areas, you should probably talk to my son, who is supervising the tour." And there it was, she thought. There was the avoidance she had expected. He was passing it off blatantly. It was no surprise. In his grand palace, poverty wasn't a problem. "Ah, here he comes now," the Sultan announced. Rebecca stepped to the side as one of the gentlemen who'd been talking with the tour group walked up beside her.
Rebecca Reed, I'd like to introduce you to my middle son, Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi. He will be supervising the tour. Zaid, this is Rebecca Reed, American envoy to the diplomatic tour party you are supervising, the Sultan said.
It was him. She hadn't been listening when the two men introduced themselves earlier, and while she shouldn't have been shocked to see him, she hadn't anticipated their meeting to occur so quickly. She stared up into his dark Arabian eyes and that warm, inviting smile that had won her over before. His dark, reddish skin and distinctly Middle Eastern features were more gorgeous in person than she remembered. She felt herself getting lost in his eyes. Again. The sheik held out his hand. She took it, and a surge of electric attraction shot through her body. Her knees were weak. She felt like she would collapse against his golden gown. She imagined him wrapping those strong Arabian arms around her and holding her against the rock-hard muscles of his chest and stomach until she regained her balance and wits. He hadn't changed much in the ensuing years, and clearly her attraction to him hadn't lessened.
She has some questions about the itinerary,
the Sultan added, bringing her back from Zaid's eyes. Yes, she stammered. I was wondering if we would be going to Rajak and Timina. Even though their affair had been short-lived, Zaid knew of her work in global poverty intervention. Even though they had lost touch, she hoped he would understand her reasons immediately and the importance of those impoverished areas to the tour's mission. Her life's work was representing the people in areas like Rajak in the hopes of preventing crime and violence.
The itinerary is full,
Zaid explained, his tone indicating that he'd prefer not to continue this discussion. Well, is there any way we could swap out some of the stops at tourist attractions for a visit to those two sections of Sharjah? She asked. Given that was a trip to lure investors, a tour of the local souks seemed unnecessary, as did spending a full day at the Sharjah Desert Park and Reserve.
I'm sorry, he said, but the itinerary is set, and it would take too long to make any changes. By the time everything was approved, we would end up missing the chance to do either option. The itinerary stands as is.
So is that it? She asked him. Are you going to pass it off like that and pretend you can't control what happens on the tour? She felt like he was trying to avoid taking responsibility.
Father, Khalid, please excuse us.
Grabbing her arm gently, he stepped away from the Sultan with her in tow.
Are we still talking about the tour?
He asked as they walked. Of course. What else could we be talking about? She snapped.
You tell me. We haven't seen each other in years. Suddenly you are here, and rather than following diplomatic protocol, you interrogate my father instead of speaking to me first. Is there any reason why you wouldn't want to speak to me first?
Rebecca opened and closed her mouth a couple times trying to figure out how best to answer, especially since he did deserve an answer even if she wasn't prepared to share it. Who was she fooling? She should never have come here. There was no way she was going to be able to do her job knowing how she felt about him.
So, how did you wind up here? He asked, interrupting her thoughts. And are you going to cause problems for me the whole time you're here?
She wanted to laugh, but his hushed tone sounded genuinely embarrassed. Sadly, yes. I'm probably going to bust your chops the whole time, she teased. But to answer your first question, I ended up taking this job because the person originally signed up for it backed out. She didn't mention that she suspected one of her friends at the embassy in the United Arab Emirates, who was aware of their affair, pulled some strings to get her in Sharjah with Zaid, in anticipation that she would see him again.
We've had other diplomatic envoys visit us from the U.S. Why now?
Zaid asked. You sound disappointed. I would have thought you'd be pleased to see me again. She couldn't keep the twinge out of her voice. While she had hoped to see him, given how they had parted, she hadn't anticipated a warm response, but he seemed angry that she was here. They had walked away from the Sultan and everyone else by that point, and now stood alone off to the side of the hall. Zaid loomed over her. She remembered how much she loved how he would tower over her. His wide shoulders hid her from the rest of the room. She recalled those shoulders spreading wide over her in bed as his body moved above her. She felt her desire for him growing once again, creating tension within her. Something about their current meeting didn't feel right. It already felt like they were at odds here. She wondered if they would have the opportunity to put that behind them and get down to some personal business at some point.
"I'm excited to see you," he said quietly. "I just feel like you're trying to spoil this tour before it's officially started."
"I'm not trying to spoil anything," she argued. "I'm simply trying to draw attention to what's already spoiled. As long as you aren't hiding anything and you're not opposed to fixing the problems you have here, you and I should get along fine."
"I think part of the problem is we don't have the problems you're implying. We have a couple of areas that haven't kept up with the progress we've made. The crime in those areas has prevented us from making as much progress in poverty alleviation. But if we get more businesses and more investments into those sections of Sharjah, we should be able to pull them up. Of course, if we show these business investors what we're fighting against, it could scare them away," he explained.
"So are you saying you're not completely opposed to showing them Rajak and Timina?" Rebecca asked.
"No, I'm trying to explain to you why we won't be going to those places as part of the tour."
"So it has nothing to do with the difficulty of trying to reschedule your precious itinerary, huh?" She loved getting to call him out.
"No, that was the answer I had to give to keep my father happy," he admitted. "It was the most politically correct answer I could give."
"Then why are you telling me any differently?" Rebecca teased. "That doesn't seem like the kind of move that would please your father, does it?"
"No, it isn't," he admitted. "But there isn't anything to hide."
"Good then. We can go."
"I didn't say that either,"
Zaid reminded her. Another man stepped up to the sheikh just then. He was a little shorter, but he was also wider than Zaid, making him look bigger. He had severe, heavy-set features, unlike Zaid's welcoming face. "Sir," the second man said, "it's time for lunch."
"Thank you. We'll be ready right away," Zaid replied. "First, Alakabak, I want you to meet Rebecca Reed. She's the envoy for the tour. Rebecca, this is Alakabak Nuzu, my father's chief advisor."
"It's a pleasure," Alakabak said to her. "The Sultan has sent a coach around for everyone," he told Zaid. "It's time to start moving our guests outside. The restaurant is waiting for us." Rebecca shot Zaid a look to let him know their conversation wasn't over, despite being interrupted. Then she allowed Alakabak to usher her up to where the other members of her tour were waiting to step onto the coach. As she waited, Rebecca knew she needed to find an opportunity to get Zaid alone, to persuade him to let her take the tour through Rajak or Timina. She couldn't shake the conviction that they needed to see some of the cracks in the Sultan's skillfully crafted facade. While the investors needed to know about any potential complications that could affect their investments, more importantly, she was determined to make sure the people in those areas finally received the help they so desperately needed. Rebecca hoped that if the Sultan wasn't willing to see reason, perhaps influence from his much-sought-after investors would ensure that reforms were made. She also couldn't shake the emotions stirred up by running into Zaid again. The desire she'd felt for him all those years ago had been reawakened, but it was more than just a sexual need for him that she felt. She wondered if their politics would once again keep them apart this time, too. Chapter 3. When they arrived at the Waterfront Palace restaurant, Sheikh Zaid led the U.S. diplomatic tour members through to the terrace overlooking the waterfront in the back of the restaurant. The table had already been set ahead of time to serve 20 people, including every member of the tour, Zaid and Alakabak, and the attending staff from the Sultan's palace. There were no place settings for security, who had traveled separately and had already been positioned in the restaurant ahead of the Sheikh's arrival. The long wooden table was draped with an immaculate white tablecloth with small floral centerpieces spaced every 2 seats along the table. Deep red napkins were folded in front of each seat for the guests, accompanied by silverware. The terrace's tiled floor reached from the back of the restaurant all the way to the water, with an ornate wrought iron fence lining the edge and a pergola covering that spanned the entire terrace to protect against the heat of the midday sun. Each place at the table had been set with a glass of iced tea, a small serving of pita bread with hummus for dipping, and a sample of dolma. The Sheikhs and Alakabak's places had also been set with black coffee. Everything was perfect, just as planned. After the waitstaff seated each member of the party, Zaid stood to give a toast with the glass of iced tea at his seat.
Again, we thank you for your interest in investing in the future of Sharjah. The Waterfront Palace staff has prepared 2 dishes for you, one with shrimp and the other with chicken in case anyone wishes to have something other than shrimp, though I couldn't imagine why.
He was pleased that the group laughed with him.
To progress.
He raised his glass as the attendees echoed his gesture and took sips from their respective glass. Zaid sat back down at his seat in the middle of the table, Alakabak to his right, the waterfront and the view of the financial district at their backs. Across from him sat a beautiful woman with dark hair who had introduced herself as the head of the tour party, Candace. Since her arrival, he had noticed her obvious attempts to get close to him, and if Rebecca had not suddenly shown back up in his life, he might have been tempted. Part of him wished that Rebecca was paying more attention, but she had intentionally placed herself as far from him as possible, which displeased him.
The Waterfront Palace is one of the few restaurants in Sharjah allowed to serve alcohol, he explained to the party. As you understand, our liquor laws differ significantly from yours at home. We do ask that you refrain from consuming alcohol in public, except where appropriate.
He hoped his explanation didn't discourage anyone from enjoying the fine selection of wine provided by the waterfront.
While I do hope you'll enjoy a selection from the wine menu, there are also non-alcoholic beverages available. Once they have your drink orders, they will ask which selection you would prefer for your main course.
And with a nod from the sheik, the waitstaff descended upon the table to get everyone's orders. He heard a few of the delegates order wine, and he watched their faces change when confronted with the main course options.
Robian Nashif is jumbo prawns, fried and served over rice and vegetables. It is a local favorite. Ruz Bukhari is chicken and spiced rice with a tomato sauce. It is also a local favorite, especially among tourists. If it helps, this region is known for its prawns, Zaid explained to his guests. His sister-in-law, Melanie, had helped him choose the menu for the lunch, going with dishes that had simple flavors that eased foreigners into the food culture of the United Arab Emirates. After the orders were placed and wine came out, Candace took a sip of her wine and leveled her enticing gray eyes on Zaid. Her dark waves rushed down around her face like water shimmering in the moonlight. "What is that across the water from us?" she asked him. Her voice dripped with suggestion, as if she wanted to talk about anything other than the sights and sounds of Sharjah. "That is the financial district," he told her in a proud tone. "As you can see from the towering modern skyscrapers, a lot of money passes through Sharjah."
"You must be very proud of the success of the emirate," she told him, as other guests turned to look at the skyline across the water.
"I am. We are," he corrected himself. "Our people have been able to climb out of poverty through our business and banking connections throughout the rest of the world. Just a couple of decades ago, this place looked like one of the poor market towns you see in so many American movies. It has since grown to be one of the cultural and financial hubs of the UAE.
Her eyes sparkled as she hung on every word he said. "You're going to personally see to it that we visit these places where you have focused your energies, correct?"
"Absolutely," Zaid smirked. "I'll make it a personal priority to ensure you get the best treatment on this tour."
As the food was delivered and Candace became distracted by the succulent shrimp placed in front of her, Zaid's eyes drifted to where Rebecca was seated. He certainly appreciated Candace's flirtatious attention, but he was much more interested in the beautiful redhead seated at the end of the table. Rebecca was laughing over a glass of iced tea with another delegate who was enjoying his glass of wine. The way she smiled at him, the way she laughed and cocked her head with those attentive eyes, those were supposed to be his. He was shocked by the jealousy that suddenly welled up inside him. It threatened to turn to anger as he watched their exchange, unable to hear what was so funny or interesting over the conversations around him. He turned his attention back to the alluring Candace sitting across from him. If he had been anything like his brothers, He would have seduced her, bringing her some place more private to have his way with her tight little American body. She wouldn't have declined his advances. She was practically throwing herself at him. When their eyes met again, she grinned and ran one of her petite feet up his leg, underneath his gown. She grabbed a piece of shrimp with her fingers and took a slow, tempting bite out of it. He watched the way her lips wrapped around the food as she bit into it. He surprised himself when the only thing he felt was amusement at her blatant attempts at seduction. She put the shrimp down and licked her fingers clean, slowly. Her apparent desire for him was incredibly typical. He was a member of royalty, and he took great care to maintain his physique. It was fairly common for women, especially foreign women, to display an undue sense of attraction towards him. He wasn't above using that attraction for his own personal gain, but poor Candace was falling all over herself for him, while the person he really wanted sat at the end of the table, engulfed in an incredibly interesting conversation with another man. Zaid's jealousy fueled his desire to flirt with the raven-haired beauty sitting across from him, if only to catch Rebecca's attention.
"So, what do you think of Sharjah so far, Miss Candace?" he asked, knowing he was toying with her by opening a door he had no intention of walking through.
"I haven't seen much yet, but I like what I see," she answered with a wink, looking him up and down. "It is a beautiful region. I especially love the way the modern world blends with the ancient world here." He ignored the way her words dripped with seduction and innuendo. It seemed to him that the blending of the old and the new versions of Sharjah was the first thing any Westerner noticed when they visited the emirate. It was a source of pride to know they'd done so well that both aspects were still unique, despite coexisting. "I want to see it all," she said with a suggestive look in her eyes. She reached across the table and stroked his hand. "Maybe the Sheikh wouldn't mind taking me on a private tour sometime?" she suggested. Even as Zaid grinned, he found himself glancing toward Rebecca, hoping no one else was listening to their conversation. Al-Kabak was discussing investments and banking with another delegate. Everyone appeared engrossed in their respective conversations and weren't listening.
"I might be able to work out something for you," he told her at last.
Why wasn't he having this conversation with Rebecca instead? He wished he'd known she was coming. He could have adjusted the seating accordingly so that the envoy and lead representative both sat across from him. Of course, with Rebecca being the envoy, the lead representative would have found herself seated across from the chief advisor instead of the sheikh. Zaid amused himself with the thought of sticking Al-Kabak with a star-struck foreigner.
"How are the prawns?"
Zaid asked her in an effort to keep the conversation going and keep himself distracted from Rebecca's conversation. "Divine," she said with enraptured delight. "Possibly the best shrimp I've ever had," she added.
"Is that right?"
Zaid asked with a smirk, sipping his coffee. "Yes, indeed," she agreed. "So, what's our next stop after this?"
"I believe the itinerary shows us walking along the waterfront to take a tour of the restaurant and entertainment district. Much of the architecture here reflects traditional styles. Plus, it is a great place to invest your personal finances."
He winked at her, turning instinctively to see if Rebecca was paying attention to his conversation, though he was sure she wouldn't have been able to hear him over the ever-so-interesting conversation she was having with one of the other tour members. He was surprised to see an empty chair. Where did she go? Chapter 4.
"Where is she?"
Zaid said aloud as he scanned the terrace area.
"Who?" "Rebecca Reed. She's gone."
Candace's brow furrowed for a brief moment, seeming perturbed at Zaid's shift in attention, but she quickly began scanning the terrace for signs of her missing partner. Zaid rose from the table.
"Please excuse me,"
he said absently. He hoped that she was still somewhere in the restaurant, just out of view, but as he stood to look around the outdoor terrace, it seemed less likely that was the case. He approached a member of the royal security detail. "Yes, sir," the guard responded as Zaid approached.
"Have you seen the woman who was seated there?"
He pointed to her empty seat. "No, sir," the guard said.
"Let the others know she is missing," he ordered. "Her name is Rebecca Reed, and you should have received a photo of her along with the others. Check your phone. She's the redhead." He left to return to the table as the security officer tapped the button on his shoulder radio receiver. Zaid heard him relaying the message to the other guards as he stepped away. They quickly mobilized. Several went into the restaurant while the ones remaining outside repositioned themselves to protect the lunch guests better. "Alakabak," Zaid whispered in the chief advisor's ear, "have you seen Rebecca Reed, the envoy accompanying the delegates?" "The redhead?" he asked. "Yes." "She went inside the restaurant a little while ago. It looked like she was walking through to the front," he answered. "And you didn't think to mention this because—" the sheik asked. "I didn't think it was important," Alakabak answered nonchalantly. "Why are you suddenly so protective of one woman?" He stared down the chief advisor, considering his next actions or words at the potential security risk if she found herself in trouble. "We are responsible for everyone on this tour," he reminded him. He could have shared any number of harsh words with the advisor, but he decided to let it go for the time being. He simply shook his head. "Unbelievable," he uttered, standing back up. Alakabak went back to his conversation with the delegate sitting next to him as he walked through the restaurant to see if security had any sightings. As he stepped out front, he swore aloud as one of the guards looked at him, startled. Zaid knew where she went. He figured he'd known it since he noticed she was missing, but didn't put it together until he walked back outside. He could not believe that she would jeopardize her safety simply to prove a point. Rajak was a few blocks over from the restaurants at the waterfront. Many of the migrant workers who served as the labor force for the area lived there. It was a rough area, as many of the residents were not registered Emirati citizens. Rebecca had been asking about the area, and she must have realized how close they were. She seemed to believe that areas like Rajak and Timina represented flaws in the growth and progress of Sharjah, when the situation was actually rather complicated. The crime in those areas didn't help the people either, compounding the problems that already existed. Zaid motioned to two of the guards to follow him as he hurried down the street to where the waterfront district crossed over to Rajak. He heard the click of heels behind him as Candace rushed to catch up with him. "No," he groaned internally. She did not need to follow him where he was going. It was bad enough that Rebecca had insisted on visiting one of the poorest sections of Sharjah. He really didn't need the tour's lead representative seeing what Rajak had to offer. If she saw what lay in wait across the bridge, it could undermine everything he was working for with the group of diplomats. "Go back to the restaurant," he ordered as she caught up with him. "I can handle this. I know where she went." "No," Candace said. "I'm coming with you. As the tour lead, I am responsible for her behavior," she argued, convincingly enough. Zaid didn't want to waste any more time arguing with the woman. He was too worried about the trouble Rebecca might get into foolishly going off on her own. "Fair enough," Zaid said. "Keep up. Stay close." As they approached the waterway that cut inland from the bay and separated the waterfront district from Rajak, Zaid's heart sank. There was no way to hide the stark contrast between the two sides of the bridge over the waterway. On one side, the waterfront district was new and modern. It was clean, bright, and populated by tourists and wealthy Emiratis. On the other side, the buildings were dilapidated and obviously outdated. There were large, gaping holes where doors should have been. A few windows sat patched up with plywood. The people wandering the streets were noticeably downtrodden. The differences were painfully obvious. But what seemed to have Candace's attention was the figure standing on the bridge over the waterway. It was Rebecca, in her gray suit and skirt, digging through a bag she carried on her shoulder with an emaciated teenager standing in front of her, an anxious look on his face as he waited for whatever was in her bag. Zaid and Candace watched as Rebecca pulled a small bundle out of her bag and handed it to the teenager. The look of gratitude on his face was easy to read even from where they stood. He pulled something out of the bundle that looked like either cake or bread and started eating. Zaid looked at Candace. "Is she feeding people?" Candace finished for him. "She is, isn't she?" Zaid said as the realization hit him. He wanted to be upset with her for being so stubborn and running off the way she had, but he couldn't help but admire her.
As furious as he was at her for sneaking off and making him worry, he was impressed by her boldness and her kindness. He sighed as his feelings about Rebecca, the feelings that already weighed on him heavily, became even more complicated. "Is that the place she wanted to visit?" Candace asked Zaid.
"Yes, that's it,"
Zaid said with contempt. He hadn't wanted Candace or any members of the tour to see Rajak or Timina. The run-down, poverty-stricken areas of town could easily deter any investors. "I knew this place existed, but I didn't anticipate that it would look so different from the rest of Sharjah. It's so poor," Candace commented.
"Yes, it is," Zaid agreed. "It's one of the areas we are still working to bring out of poverty,"
he said absently, watching as nearby 2 men eyed her shoulder bag.
"Listen," he said, motioning to one of the guards. "You need to get back to the waterfront palace. My guard will escort you."
He wanted to get her out of there before anything bad happened. With too few guards with him, things could escalate quickly, and he didn't want to be divided on who he was protecting. "But," Candace started to argue.
"But nothing. You can see for yourself that she's safe. There's nothing else here for you, and your presence makes us less safe. Now, go."
As Candace turned to leave and head back to the restaurant with the guard following, Zaid told the remaining guard to call for the car before he headed towards the bridge where Rebecca stood. The 2 men who had been watching her had begun to close in. Zaid could see they were still eyeing her bag, no doubt planning to snatch it from her. It was only a matter of time before they struck. Though he had insisted that she not go to Rajak. If anything happened to her, it would inevitably fall back on him. The safety of everyone involved with the tour was his responsibility. But that was not the only reason. He couldn't let anything happen to her. He hit the bridge just as one of the 2 men shoved her hard, sending her tumbling to the ground, and the other reached for her bag, yanking it from her shoulder. In a few quick strides, he had overtaken the first man as he started to run after the man with her bag. Zaid, having a considerable size advantage, could have at least grabbed one of the men and detained him, but when he heard Rebecca cry out, he was far more worried about her. After the men ran off, tossing items from Rebecca's bag as they ran, he motioned to the guard who had run up behind him to pick up the few personal items that had spilled onto the bridge. As Zaid marched over to her, his adrenaline surge suddenly drained away, leaving nothing but anger behind. Rebecca was sitting hunched on the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees.
"I told you we weren't going to Rajak for a reason. Are you happy now?" he admonished as he approached. "I should send you back to the States for endangering members of your party with your reckless behavior."
"I'm sorry," she said, looking down at her feet. She wouldn't look up at him as he approached her.
"You could have been hurt, or worse, Rebecca, and now Candace has seen this place. Your whole party is going to know about the crime and poverty just around the corner," he continued.
"Of course," she said. "I don't know what I was thinking." She answered him in a monotone, which only seemed to fuel his ire.
"You weren't thinking. That's the problem. You were over here trying to play humanitarian instead of thinking about what you were doing or where you were. You are not in America, Rebecca. You don't have the same protections here as you would at home. If I hadn't figured out where you were headed—"
His voice wavered as he tried to control his rising panic at losing her when she'd only just come back into his life.
"I don't even want to think about what could have happened to you."
He wanted to scare her. He wanted her to be as afraid as he had been when he saw what was about to happen to her, what could have happened if he hadn't stepped in when he did. She needed to be afraid. "What do we do now?" she asked meekly.
"A car is on the way to take us back to the palace. Everyone else will return to the hotel for the evening. The tour is over for the day, thanks to you,"
he answered, his voice hard. Except then he saw she was trembling. His anger softened in the face of her vulnerability. This was Rebecca he was looking at. The little firecracker wasn't afraid of anything. Yet here she was, visibly shaken by what had just occurred. He put a hand on her shoulder, a feeble gesture for sure, but it was better than doing nothing.
"I'm glad you're okay," he said more calmly. Damn it, Rebecca, you could have been hurt. Please don't do that again."
She finally looked up at him, and he saw tears welling up in her blue eyes, threatening to spill over. He wanted to take her in his arms and embrace her, to hold and comfort her, but not here, not now. She was visiting him on official business. It would have been improper for either one of them to be caught displaying any affection toward each other. Holding his hand out, he helped her stand as they walked toward the black Mercedes that had just pulled up. A member of the security team stepped out of the front passenger side. "Is everything okay?" he asked as he approached Zaid and Rebecca.
"We're fine, thankfully,"
Zaid said, putting a hand on Rebecca's back to help her into the car. Once in the back seat on the way to the palace, the security guard handed Rebecca the belongings that had been scattered across the pavement on the bridge. As she held her personal effects in her lap, Zaid caught a quick glimpse of a picture of a young boy. A boy who looked like Rebecca, but with Middle Eastern features.
"Who's this?"
he said, reaching for the picture. Snatching the picture before he could take it, she tucked it under the other items on her lap. Zaid. Closing her mouth, she stared resolutely out the window, refusing to say more. Placing his hand calmly on hers, he waited for her to turn to look at him. She looked terrified. Speaking quietly, so as not to scare her further, he asked again,
"Who is it?"
He waited patiently as she chewed her lower lip, her worry evident in her desire not to respond. With a heavy sigh, she reached for the picture and handed it to him. Meeting his gaze, "That's Caleum," she answered. "My son." Chapter 5. Back at the palace in Zaid's private quarters, Rebecca sat in one of the chairs in stony silence while the palace doctor checked her out to make sure she was okay. She knew she was fine, but Zaid had insisted that she let the doctor examine her. First flashing a light in her eyes, she blinked away the tears from the bright light as he continued to examine her. Pressing various spots on her neck, shoulders, and back, he asked her questions about her pain levels as she gave the same reply. No pain. Cleaning off the scrapes on her hands from where she fell, he wrapped up the exam. While she sat, she watched Zaid's expression. The doctor poked and prodded her, but so long as he wasn't asking her questions, she didn't pay him much mind. Her attention was focused almost solely on the sheikh himself, who had remained silent in the car after she had admitted that Caleum was her son. In fact, he had yet to say anything to her, which only made the matter that much worse. His face darkened repeatedly, as if his anger came in waves, crashing as he stood off to the side, watching the doctor examine her. She knew he was upset about her actions and jeopardizing the tour, but judging from the way he clutched Caleum's photo, their next discussion would be of a far more personal nature. Simply looking at the photo, it was obvious who the father was, and from the look on Zaid's face, he was very aware of that fact. Watching his expression darken again, she swallowed hard, suddenly wishing the doctor would find a reason to take her to the hospital, so she wouldn't have to be alone with him. "Well, Miss Reed, you're fine," the doctor said finally. "You're lucky. You shouldn't have strayed from the rest of the group. This isn't America. You aren't as free here as it may seem, and you aren't protected as a citizen. You need to remember that the next time you're out." "I will, thanks," Rebecca snapped. "Is that all, doctor?" Her response sounded harsh even to her ears. "Thank you again," she added in a calmer tone. Nodding his head, he squeezed her arm lightly before turning to Zaid. "Make sure she gets plenty of fluids and rest. She may be in shock." Zaid blew out a breath she hadn't realized he was holding.
"I will. Thank you, doctor."
He sounded grateful for the doctor's news and advice, and shook the man's hand warmly before seeing him to the door. When he came back into his quarters, he closed and locked the door. The anger had returned to his face.
"We need to talk,"
he said. She flinched at his tone as he reached for her hand and pulled her to her feet. Walking with her over to the couch, he waited until she sat down before joining her. Caleum's photo was back in his hand. The picture seemed so small in his large hands. For a minute, it seemed like he wasn't going to say anything. He sat and stared at the picture, rubbing his thumb over the boy's face. Rebecca was flooded with regret that she'd never reached out to him after their last night together all those years ago. Maybe it had been a mistake not to tell him, but she had her reasons, some of which were going to have to come out tonight.
"You never told me," he said.
That impressive, booming voice of his had gone hollow and frail. He wasn't Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi at that moment. He was simply Zaid, a normal man looking at a picture of his son for the first time. "I know," Rebecca said quietly, bracing herself for the backlash.
"You said his name is Caleum?"
he asked. "Yeah, Caleum Reed." She put a gentle hand on his arm and felt the tense muscles through the sleeve of his gown.
"He's what, 5?
"Almost," she answered. She wondered what he was thinking as he stared at the photo. The resemblance between them was uncanny. Caleum could have been his clone.
"Why didn't you ever reach out to me?"
he asked. The question came out harsh. "Look, the nights we spent together, they were amazing." Her own voice quavered. "If things had been different, maybe we could have been something. But you're a sheik, and I'm—" She knew it made it harder for him to understand when he only knew part of the story. He knew about her position in the government as a diplomat, but he didn't know the rest, the part that drove her to strive for justice and to further the purpose of peace wherever she went. And she couldn't tell him all of her secrets. Some things just needed to stay buried for everyone's safety, hers, Zaid's, and especially Caleum's. "I didn't want to drag you down in what I've had to deal with," she finished. The sheik stared at her with a strange look in his eyes.
"You do understand I am one of the most powerful members of one of the most influential families in the world, right?"
"Which is more reason to have left you alone," she argued. "Your family's wealth and power didn't need to get caught up in what was going on with my family any more than you did."
"I'm afraid I don't understand," he said. "What was going on with your family that I couldn't have helped you with?"
She couldn't tell him everything. That her parents had been dissidents and she'd spent almost every summer camping in some war-torn part of the world as they worked to help the local populace rebuild. That her parents had eventually pulled her and her sister out of school with the intent to homeschool, but simply never got around to it. She could never tell him that this wasn't her first visit to Sharjah or the enemies her parents made, or the fear she had lived in when they went into hiding as a result. The number of favors her parents had tried to call in to find a safe haven for her and her sister and the aging aunt who had agreed to take them in, changing their last name to match hers and insisting that the sisters have no further contact with her parents. If it weren't for her upbringing and her education, Rebecca would never have obtained the job she has now, advising governments on how best to remedy the poorer areas in their locales. However, she still had nightmares of that fateful night. She had just turned 11, and she had clutched tightly to her then 7-year-old sister, not wanting her to see the horror of their parents held at gunpoint. How many nights did she relive that moment as she held Amy to her, waiting for the madmen to murder their parents right in front of them? From the moment she had found out she was pregnant, she vowed that she would never intentionally place Caleum in harm's way, and that meant keeping him away from the Middle East until he was old enough to understand. And while Zaid might be able to accept her family, she knew that it would be completely unacceptable to his father, who ruled Sharjah much like a monarchy. "Just understand it's political, and sometimes the world we live in won't see us for the individuals we are versus who our family is," she explained, telling him as much as she was able to.
"Do you think I don't know that?"
he questioned. Straightening her shoulders, she looked at him. "It isn't the same, but I don't expect you to understand that."
"I want to meet him,"
Zaid said, switching back to Caleum, turning the picture over in his hand. She pulled her hand back from him. "Don't you think, after tonight, that this place is too dangerous for our son?" she asked. "I mean, you try to hide the problems, and that just makes them worse. That breeds more of what we saw today. It's only going to get worse until something is done to fix it." Zaid gave her a sly little smile.
"You spooked yourself a little bit today, didn't you? And of course that means that this place is suddenly oh so dangerous, huh? If you had listened to me, you wouldn't have been in any danger."
"You don't understand, Zaid," she argued. "Listen to me. This is the kind of thing I've spent my life around. When you have problems like you see in Rajah, when you have that kind of poverty, if you ignore it instead of trying to help those people, things only get worse. Much worse. I don't mean any offense, Zaid, but you don't see it from in here. You can't possibly see it." He sighed.
"You don't see what we've accomplished to try to help, and part of what we hope to achieve with further investments is providing more relief to those troubled areas. I know there's a lot of work left. We have to get jobs in place for the people in Rajah and Timina so that they can start contributing. I know this, but don't let one isolated event make you think the sky is falling. The sky is not falling over the Emirate of Sharjah, and our son will be safe here."
Rebecca shook her head. He talked a good game, but she wasn't prepared to take any chances with her son. "But no, back to your original statement. I don't think bringing him here is a good idea," she finally said. "Life had been so much simpler when they'd worked together in America, when she'd escorted him on a private visit to the States. Their relationship had been more than just professional, and their connection sitting together now was proof of that. The locked door, the privacy, Zaid's bossy version of tenderness, those things were all proof that they were more to each other than mere acquaintances who happened to have a child together." She reached for him again, wanting to run her hands over his shoulder and down his strong arm. "I should be getting back to the hotel," she muttered.
"No," he said flatly. "You're not going back to the hotel. You're going to stay here. I will see to it that you are protected and that all your needs are tended to, but here, at the palace."
"Zaid, I really appreciate the offer and the concern. Really, I do, but all of my things are at the hotel, and the rest of my group is there," she explained. She stood up to signal to him that it really was time for her to go.
"No," he argued. "I insist. Stay here and let the Sultan's staff take care of you. You will reunite with the delegates each day. You've no need to stay at the same hotel as well."
There were so many reasons for her to say no, even though her heart was screaming at her to say yes. Fighting her immediate impulse to acquiesce, she shook her head. "Zaid, no. And please, let's leave it at that," she pleaded. Zaid stood from the couch, towering over her all of a sudden.
"I'll have your things brought over from the hotel this afternoon. Right now, I have a meeting to attend. I'll see you tonight at dinner."
He moved to the door and started to unlock it. "Damn it, Zaid, listen to me," Rebecca demanded. "I've made it just fine without you for the last 5 years. I made it fine on my own before I ever knew you. I don't suddenly need your charity now," she argued. "I'm going back to the hotel."
"I'm sorry I wasn't around for the two of you," Zaid said without looking back at her. "I'm having your things brought over. I'll see you at dinner after my meeting."
He walked out of the room, and she could hear the click of the door lock as she fumed. She'd known he could be controlling, but she'd never seen him quite like that. He had intentionally ignored her comments. She wasn't going to stand for it, she told herself, but she didn't know what to do to make it right. At least not while she was locked in his quarters. Chapter 6.
"I'll have a private plane at the airport to make the international flight. Make sure everything is handled on your end. I'll also have a car waiting at the airport here. Remember, no customs, no paperwork or documentation. My pilot will take over at the airport, and you won't have anything else to worry about at that point,"
Zaid explained over the phone as Alakabak entered his private office.
"I've got to go. Remember, everything else is handled. Meet the pilot at the airport. I have it from there. Talk to you again soon."
Zaid disconnected the call. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Alakabak apologized.
"No, making some business arrangements,"
Zaid lied. "Sounds like it," Alakabak responded, his tone devoid of any emotion. Zaid invited the chief advisor to sit down in front of his desk. He wasn't completely over Alakabak's dismissive attitude at the restaurant, where he'd allowed Rebecca to wander off without alerting anyone. He had created a liability for the Sheikh with his lack of concern over the well-being of the tour group. For now, however, he kept this concern to himself.
"What brings you by this afternoon?"
Zaid asked instead. "I want to talk to you about the woman from the diplomatic tour group," he started. "Rebecca Reed. I've noticed you two seem to have some sort of history together." Zaid sensed he was being set up for something. He wondered how much Al-Akabak knew about their history already, since he was bold enough to approach Zaid about it.
I worked with her 5 years ago on a private visit to the United States to meet with some investors and other business partners. She was appointed as an assistant to me at the time,
Zaid said. Al-Akabak nodded thoughtfully. Zaid could see the wheels turning behind the 48-year-old's eyes. He was up to something. Zaid knew he couldn't trust him. "How well do you know her?" he asked Zaid.
"I'm not sure I understand the question. I wouldn't say I know her that well at all. We've only worked together," Zaid answered. "What's going on here, Al-Akabak? Why do I feel like you're interviewing me?"
Again, the chief advisor paused thoughtfully. "I have to investigate any suspected incidents of impropriety," he answered after a moment. His answers were so matter-of-fact and bold, Zaid was becoming certain that the man had some piece of information already that he wasn't willing to share just yet.
"What impropriety do you suspect, then?"
Zaid prompted. "She was brought back to your private quarters after lunch. I'm simply following up."
"I had her examined by a doctor after she was attacked outside the restaurant. I didn't think I had to answer to you for taking that kind of action, especially not to someone whose inaction put the welfare of the group at risk," Zaid answered.
"I guess it's a good thing their welfare isn't my responsibility, then," Al-Akabak responded. "Maybe your sense of responsibility towards this woman is influenced by something other than your professional position in relation to her."
"I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Mr. Nuzu,"
Zaid answered, dropping the advisor's first name. He hoped he would get the point and stop pursuing whatever information he thought he could expose by interviewing Zaid.
"If you have a specific accusation, it would do you well to present it now, or drop it altogether,"
Zaid commanded. "Yes, sir," Al-Akabak said in a careful tone. "I do apologize if I have offended you in any way."
"You certainly have, implying that I would have improper relations with a member of the diplomatic tour group visiting our country."
Zaid adopted a tone of seniority, re-establishing his authority over his father's chief advisor. "Yes, sir, that was hasty and presumptuous of me," the advisor continued, his tone still neutral.
"It was."
Zaid let his last statement hang in the air between them for a moment. "How did you like working with her before?" Al-Akabak asked, adopting a friendlier tone, though Zaid felt certain he was simply trying a different approach to get information out of the sheikh. Zaid couldn't resist answering the question, though, and giving Al-Akabak an idea of who she was.
"She is very easy to work with, and she is very passionate about her work. In fact, that is what got her in trouble today."
"How did escorting the diplomatic tour group get her in trouble?" he asked Zaid. Zaid realized he'd said too much, and now he had to tell Al-Akabak everything that had happened and why.
"She wants the touring investors to visit Rajak and Timina. She's afraid they'll think twice before investing in us if they discover we haven't been forthcoming about the situation of the unemployed,"
Zaid said, bracing for the backlash, as he suspected Al-Akabak would think he'd somehow supported her ideals. "So when she left the restaurant today, she went to Rajak, didn't she?" he asked for clarification.
"That's exactly what she did,"
Zaid told him. His fear that she might have been hurt far worse than scratched elbows and knees kept him from admitting that he was impressed by her tenacity and refusal to accept the status quo. "What happened?"
"She was accosted by 2 men who took her bag with her belongings and money in it,"
Zaid answered. "But she's fine, correct? And what of the 2 men?"
"They got away. Since she was knocked to the ground, we stopped to tend to her."
Al-Akabak's eyes narrowed. Wrong answer. "Be careful, Zaid," Al-Akabak cautioned. "Her behavior smacks of activism. I will conduct a background check on her. If she's going to cause us trouble, we need to be ahead of her." Zaid was uncomfortable with the idea of Al-Akabak looking into Rebecca's history. He didn't know what kind of information the advisor would find, but there was at least one piece of information he would prefer remain confidential until he had everything sorted with Caleum. His father would be furious if he found out there was an illegitimate child. But before he could lay claim to him as his rightful father, he had to find out why Rebecca was so opposed to it. She was hiding something, but he had yet to figure out what.
"That won't be necessary,"
he told the Sultan's advisor. "I'm sorry?"
"Miss Reed would not have been allowed to come on this tour without first passing a rigorous screening process like all the other attendees," Zaid said. "I've worked with her before, and I trust her."
There wasn't much he could say about Rebecca that didn't sound like he was admitting some of his feelings for her. "Good. If you trust her, then you should feel confident that I won't find anything," Alakabak replied.
"I feel confident enough that I don't want you wasting palace resources on doing a background on her,"
Zaid argued. A sly, dirty smile spread across Alakabak's face. "I won't waste any palace resources. Don't worry. I have my own." He stood up to leave. "I hope I don't find any evidence of impropriety between the two of you, because I will be forced to act on it if anything like that comes up."
"Certainly,"
Zaid said, watching the chief advisor leave his office. He sat back in his chair and wondered if Alakabak would even pull her background information. Of course he would. And it was likely he'd find out about Caleum and the political family ties Rebecca had been reluctant to discuss with him in detail. If news of his illegitimate son got out before he had a chance to claim him, he could be ruined. His father, the Sultan, was still furious at his brothers for choosing Americans as their brides, and it had been his fervent wish that Zaid choose a more conventional bride. Rebecca was anything but conventional. He had learned a bit about her upbringing from what she had shared with him 5 years ago, and his own investigator had filled in the blanks. While he had been surprised to find out her family history, he had kept it to himself, hoping that Rebecca would trust him enough to share with him what he already knew. When they had parted ways, he thought he'd never see her again. But now that they had a child between them, things were very different. What he didn't understand was what Alakabak's endgame. The man had served his father for years and was, if anything, consistently indifferent. What changed now, and why was he so obvious about his intentions?
"I have my own resources as well,"
he said aloud in his empty office as he picked up his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts. He would do his own background check on the advisor, with the hope that he wasn't particularly careful about covering his tracks. After he disconnected the call with his contact, Zaid sat back and thought about Rebecca. She'd been adamant about not staying in the palace where it was safe, and that bothered him, especially after learning that they had a son together. That knowledge made her safety his #1 priority as long as she was under his watch. There was a knock at the door. It was one of the palace staff members, peeking his head in the door. "Sheikh Zaid?" he said timidly as he entered.
"Yes, what is it?"
Zaid asked, impatient for being interrupted. "It's Miss Reed, sir," the staff member said.
"Yes?"
"One of the maids didn't realize that there was anyone in your quarters when she opened the room to clean. Miss Reed requested a car and has left for the hotel," he informed him. Zaid shook his head.
"Thank you for telling me,"
Zaid said. Alone again, he paced his office. He was tempted to go to the hotel and drag her back, kicking and screaming, but he didn't dare with Alakabak nosing around. He'd have to tread carefully. He wasn't going to let her get away with shrugging him off, but he wasn't sure how to make her obey him. Then it occurred to him that it wasn't so much about making her obey him as it was about not giving her any other option. But eliminating her ability to make her own decisions, leaving her stuck with simply going along with whatever he had devised, didn't seem right either. He had to find some way to convince her to go along with him that didn't amount to forcing her to agree to his will. She had to understand that staying in the palace was in her best interest, as a diplomat, as a personal matter between them, and as the mother of his son. Chapter 7. Rebecca had fumed the entire way back to the hotel. She could not believe that he had actually locked her in his quarters as if she were some sort of criminal. Vowing to spend as little time alone with him as possible, she dressed for tonight's dinner with the delegates, smirking at Zaid's potential responses when he found out that she had managed to outmaneuver him and leave the palace. She didn't think much of it when the young man at her door told her he'd been sent to escort her to dinner. Given what happened in Rajak, she assumed it was another way for Zaid to exert his control over the tour, and she was delighted at the idea of him seeing her in the black gown she was wearing to dinner that evening. She couldn't wait to feel his eyes following the subtle curves of her petite body in the form-fitting black fabric as she kept her distance. When she realized the driver was taking her to the palace instead of to dinner with the tour group, she was tempted to tell him to take her to the restaurant, but she thought better of it. He'd figured out a way to get her to go along with him after all, it seemed. She wanted to be upset with him, but she couldn't bring herself to be. While she had been angry with him for locking her in his quarters, she also knew that it was his way of trying to keep her safe. After the incident that afternoon, she wasn't sure who was more worried, Zaid or her. Looking down at her gown, she smirked, knowing how much he would appreciate it as she contemplated ways to arouse him at dinner. If he was going to try to push her around, she was prepared to retaliate in the best way she knew how. The driver pulled up to the palace, and another staff member escorted her from the car to a rooftop terrace overlooking the rest of Sharjah, where a table for two had been prepared. Zaid waited with his back to her, wearing a suit with his traditional headpiece. Turning, he pocketed his cell phone as his gaze swept over her appreciatively. Walking toward him, he murmured his approval as he greeted her with his warm, welcoming smile. She had never been able to resist that smile. "I am glad you could make it," he said, walking in a circle around her, admiring her gown. "You look good enough to eat." His comment had her wondering what he had planned for dessert. "Cute," she replied, moving toward the table so he couldn't see the flush creeping across her cheeks. "You do realize I didn't have a choice, don't you?" She threw over her shoulder as she neared the table. Before she could sit on her own, he was suddenly beside her, holding her chair out for her. "You could have told the driver no," Zaid reminded her, standing close enough to her that his suit jacket brushed against her bare arm. "I'm guessing he didn't speak English," she commented, reaching for her napkin, but he beat her to it again, shaking it with a flourish and setting it across her lap. "This from a woman who speaks Arabic," he murmured against her ear before walking to the other side of the table to sit down. Ignoring his comment about her language skills, she pressed him. "He presented himself as picking me up for dinner with the tour," she argued, wanting to be angry but finding it increasingly difficult. His dark features seemed infused with pride. "You still could have told him you hadn't arranged for a private driver to your dinner," he teased. She narrowed her eyes at him. "Either way, you've got me here, now." He laughed, a warm and hearty sound. "I'm pleased," he said again, and she could see in his dark eyes that he meant it. He wasn't simply teasing her as he had been at first. "I am too," she admitted. "I'm pleased we're finally getting to do this. I'm not happy about missing dinner with the tour group, but it's not the first time we've skipped out on an important dinner together, is it?" She felt herself blush at the memory of that night all those years ago, the last night they'd spent together. "No, I guess it's not," Zaid agreed. She looked out over the city from the rooftop terrace. The sun was setting, lighting the sky on fire and setting the city aglow with its golden light. It was easy to see why so much of the Sultan's world was decorated in gold. It mirrored the beautiful radiance of the Arabian sun. "So, what's on the menu tonight?" Rebecca asked. She drank in his imposing physique in his tailored suit. "Well," he started, picking up his glass of red wine and raising it to her, "I thought we'd start off with a drink." She grabbed her glass. "Wine? I remember you telling me that your father didn't allow alcohol at the palace," she said. "He doesn't," he answered with a wink. "Technically, we aren't in the palace." She chuckled as she sipped her red wine. "I'm surprised your father hasn't already arranged a marriage for you to preserve your wealth and status," she said. If she were honest with herself, part of the reason she'd never contacted him after she'd learned she was pregnant was because she knew there was no chance of a future between them. At the time, she'd thought it was better to let their feelings for each other fade than to risk the pain of being separated again. She hadn't known then how often she would think of Zaid in the years that followed, how often she would see him in Caleum.
"It's a long story, and you would have enjoyed being here for it," he told her, "but I am allowed to choose my own wife."
His eyes leveled on her as he spoke, drawing the blush out in her fair cheeks. "I see." She cleared her throat. He couldn't possibly be hinting. Besides, there was no way she could uproot Caleum, take him away from everything he'd ever known for a man she hardly knew anymore. Hell, for a man she'd never really known well. She filled the awkward silence. "So, what's the main course tonight?"
"Lamb with grilled vegetables and rice," he answered.
Her heart raced, but he seemed not to notice how she'd changed the subject, or the impact of his words. She was making too much of his revelation, clearly, and yet it hadn't escaped her notice that it was the same dinner he'd arranged for them in the States 5 years ago on their last rendezvous. It also wasn't lost on her that they were wearing the same clothes they'd worn on that fateful, magical night. She sat quietly with Zaid as a maid brought out a metzis platter with different-flavored hummus, fresh pita, stuffed grape leaves, and marinated olives. The silence between them felt awkward, as if neither one of them knew what to say to the other over their wine and the sunset. "So, when you do finally marry and accept your inheritance, are you going to do more to help the people who are suffering in the emirate?" she finally asked. Zaid sipped his wine before answering.
"You know, I don't remember you being quite this political."
"I wasn't," she agreed. "A lot has happened since we were together. I've always been interested in helping the less fortunate, of course, because that's how you prevent some of the violence that has affected my family. But I used to know my place, so to speak." She laughed nervously. "I forgot my place somewhere along the way, I guess."
"Well, I can assure you I will continue the work I've already been doing to help my father draw more wealth into the region to bring all our people out of poverty. It's a complex problem here, though, and it's going to take a lot of work to solve the issue."
She was impressed by his answer. He always knew the right things to say, even if he didn't know exactly the reality of his words. At least his heart was in the right place, she reminded herself, even if there was no way he could understand poverty the way she did. "I think one of the ways to help the problem will be to stop trying to hide it, or maybe to stop trying to hide from it," she suggested.
Zaid sighed. "I should have let you attend the tour dinner tonight. I can see our dinner is going to be plagued by this political talk. I get enough of it from my father and his advisor. And trust me, Rebecca, we're working on it. There's more to it than simply throwing money their way. There are other issues in play that must be resolved so we can start revitalizing our poorer areas and bring them up to par with the rest of the region."
"I'm sorry," she said. "You're right. Let's enjoy each other's company." She raised her wineglass to him and drank a little more from it before she reached out to nibble on the appetizers. From where they sat on the palace rooftop, she understood why poverty wasn't a huge topic for the sheikh or the rest of the royal family. She couldn't pinpoint any of the poor sections of Sharjah from where they were. As the sun melted into the horizon, it revealed a lush, golden paradise in the middle of the desert, reminding the viewer why people had been drawn to the region for centuries. Whereas Europeans had believed that the streets were paved with gold in the New World, the Arabian sun seemed to spin gold from thin air. And judging by the wealth held in the region, there must have been some truth to it. As dinner came out and they began eating, she couldn't help but ask, "So how is it that you get to choose your own wife? That's awfully modern, isn't it?"
Zaid gave her a rueful smile. "My father may be traditional, but he's not stupid, and after my brothers—"
He told her about the mess his brothers had made of their arranged marriages, abandoning the women their father had chosen for women they'd met in America. She tried not to let herself feel anything as he recounted the story, but there seemed to be a definite trend in his family. Sipping her wine, she couldn't resist speaking up. "Well, from everything you've said, the three of you definitely seem to have a thing for American women," she teased. Shrugging his shoulders, he mimicked her movements with his own wine as he looked at her across the top of his glass.
My brothers are more progressive, and as Sharjah continues to modernize, they want to see changes in our culture as well.
And you don't? She didn't know why she was prodding him. Taking another drink, he continued to look at her.
There has only ever been one American woman of interest to me, and she has made a point of resisting me at every turn.
Rebecca flushed and quickly gulped her wine, coughing slightly as she swallowed too much too fast. This was not going how she had planned. She had thought she would be the one making him flustered. She set the empty glass down, and Zaid refilled it for her as she concentrated on her meal. They ate in silence before he broke it, asking her about her recent work. She told him about some of the places she'd visited for work and how having to leave her son at home made her regret her career choice from time to time.
"Who does he stay with when you're gone?" he questioned.
"My sister, Amy. He adores his auntie."
"So there's no male father figure in his life?"
"No, there isn't. It didn't seem appropriate." She wasn't sure how to answer the question. She wanted to tell him about how often she dreamed about him. She wanted to let him know that every time she looked into Caleum's eyes, she saw Zaid staring back at her, and she simply couldn't bring herself to date someone else. But she didn't know how to drop the walls she'd built up over the years. Her career and family had kept her from being able to stick with the only man she'd ever really had feelings for, and she didn't want to lose anyone else to the life she'd chosen for herself. So she'd walled herself away from the rest of the world, shutting everyone out to the point that she didn't even know how to let Zaid back in. The one person she wanted to let in. By the end of the dinner, their awkwardness was gone. All the political talk, the nostalgic hindsight, and the stilted small talk gave way to two friends being able to reconnect after 5 years apart. "You know, there are times when Caleum makes me want to call my parents and apologize for all the things I did as a kid," Rebecca said, shaking her head, resting her hand on the table. More than anything, she wanted him to take it, to wrap her fingers in his warmth. Zaid chuckled.
"I can't imagine raising a little version of me," he added.
"That's exactly what he is, too," she told him, glancing away, unable to meet his eyes. "Every time I look at him, I see you. He likes to be on top of things the way you do, too. He is definitely the take-charge type."
"I would very much like to meet him," Zaid said, his voice quiet. "I would like to be part of his life. Of your life."
He took her hand then, and just as before, an electric jolt went through her, electrifying her, as if she'd been waiting all these years for his touch. She brought her eyes to his. "I'd love for you to meet him, at some point. I'm not sure about bringing him to Sharjah, where it seems like the remaining pockets of poverty are beginning to turn violent," she admitted.
"It isn't that bad,"
Zaid practically growled in frustration, pulling his hand away from hers. "How would you know?" she shot back. "You're always protected by armed security. He's just a little boy."
"He's also my son. He will have all the protection necessary, far more than what he has now."
Rebecca stood up from the table as the maids came to clear it. Stalking toward the edge of the terrace, she kept her back to him as she stared out toward the horizon, watching the sky darken. She stiffened when she felt his hands on her waist. Sighing, she leaned back against him. "It's incredibly beautiful here." Pushing her hair aside, he nuzzled her neck before kissing a line from her ear down to her shoulder. As she started to pull away from him, he tightened his hold on her as he continued to kiss her.
"It is indeed,"
he murmured, the sound of his voice causing goosebumps to pop up on her arms as she shivered in his arms. "We aren't finished talking about this, Zaid," she admonished as she felt her resolve cracking away with each kiss. Switching to the other side of her neck, he repeated the kisses on that side.
"Agreed."
Knowing she needed to put a stop to this, she tried again. "We also can't do this in your father's home."
"It's my home too, and as I pointed out earlier, we aren't in it, we're on it."
She chuckled before moaning as he resumed kissing her. Standing here like this reminded her of that night they had stood on the balcony of her hotel room, the same way they stood on the palace terrace tonight, the culmination of a whirlwind romance that had developed over the course of his visit to the States. She had been young and impressionable, or so she told herself to make missing him sting a little less. He was a blend of confidence and kindness, a gentle giant who knew all the right ways to touch a woman, but could still use his body to keep her safe, the way he had at the bridge today. As they'd watched the sun melt into the horizon from her hotel room, she had turned to kiss him and found him waiting for her, eager as she planted her lips gently against his. Their mouths opened together, allowing their tongues to meet between them. Their kiss filled her body with the golden rays of the setting sun. She had wrapped her arms around him and pulled him against her as her desire grew for him, burning deep within. She pulled back from the kiss to find that they weren't standing on the balcony of her American hotel room. They were standing on the rooftop terrace. No matter how much she had missed him, no matter how many dreams she'd had over the years, she wasn't ready to do this again. She couldn't believe that she was allowing her emotions to get the best of her. She was in Sharjah to do a job, not to rekindle her long-lost love. I need to go, she said quietly, and pulled herself away from Zaid, stumbling as she hurried from the terrace. Chapter 8. After Rebecca left, Zaid spent a restless night going over everything that had happened at dinner. Unable to sleep, he ended up in the palace gym and spent the next 40 minutes pounding out his pent-up energy on the treadmill. When he finally stopped, he was thinking more clearly. Rebecca had been right to leave. He still had no idea what Alakabak was up to, and it wasn't a smart idea to provide him with whatever fuel he was after right under his nose. Thankfully, Candace didn't say anything about the attack on the bridge to any of the investors, and they were eager to continue their tour today. He stood in the lobby of the brand-new sports complex and business conference center with Alakabak Nuzu beside him. They welcomed the members of the tour as they arrived from the hotel, escorted by a small security detail unit. The front of the building was all glass. Inside, the lobby was wide open, taking up the whole front of the building. As the guests walked in through the glass door, Zaid approached with his arms spread wide to welcome them, stepping away from Alakabak, who would have been content to wait for them to walk up to him.
Welcome to the new Sharjah Sports Complex and Conference Center. I apologize for being unable to accompany you yesterday afternoon. An urgent matter came up, but I trust the representatives from the palace were able to keep everything on track, Zaid began. As the last few guests entered the building and joined the group, including Rebecca, bringing up the rear just as she had when they first arrived, Zaid continued, This modern building was recently built by the Tadros twins. Its amenities include state-of-the-art athletic facilities and a modern conference center. It also offers shuttle services to and from all the major hotels in Sharjah, so that visitors don't have to worry about securing their own transportation. This represents another step forward for the region as we strive to keep up with our neighbors and bring the emirate into the 21st century.
There was one sour face in the group, one person who didn't seem overly impressed with the conference center. Rebecca. I have some questions, she announced from the back of the group.
Yes, Miss Reed,
Zaid answered, keeping his voice pleasant, though inwardly he groaned.
I'll be happy to answer your questions.
After she'd run away from him last night, he'd resolved to keep things strictly professional, at least while they were with the investors. First, how much were the workers paid? She asked.
This again, Zaid thought, as he gritted his teeth and pasted a smile on his face.
Whatever warmth there might have been between them the night before, whatever he'd managed to hold on to after she'd bolted, vanished. Why couldn't Rebecca ever simply let it rest?
Now, as far as the details of worker compensation, hours, and benefits, all of that is handled by the National Labor Board. Their job is to ensure that companies hiring in any of the United Arab Emirates pay fair wages, provide acceptable benefits, and provide work hours in accordance with our labor laws, Alakabak might know a little more about the specific details of this particular project, but if you want concrete answers, you'll have to go to the Labor Board.
He had prepared for these types of questions. He was not going to let her blindside him. Besides, he was rather proud of the labor laws. But aren't those regulations in place only for registered Emirati citizens, leaving little to no protection for migrant workers? She countered. Why she had to make it her purpose to find flaws with everything in Sharjah, to constantly bring up the workers and poverty, he didn't know, but he'd be damned if she got him to lose his cool. It was like she wanted some sort of vengeance against him personally, when it wasn't his fault he hadn't been there for her, for their son. She hadn't even told him. If he hadn't found that picture, maybe she never even would have.
I believe that is true. There are very few protections for migrant workers. We are trying to discourage the use of migrant workers, as we have plenty of able-bodied citizens here who can do this work. The Labor Board has restrictions on when migrant workers can be used and how many can be employed at a time,
Zaid explained. Yes, I know about the restrictions, but estimates show that as much as 70% of the workforce in Sharjah is made up of migrant workers, many of whom are undocumented, allowing employers to keep their reporting numbers low so that they remain within the legal limits. These workers are not guaranteed living wages, reasonable hours, or benefits by the Labor Board. Furthermore, there is no national minimum wage that would protect all workers. The Labor Board assigns or approves wages based on the job itself. That works out great for registered citizens, but again, those regulations don't apply to migrant workers.
Zaid stammered. I don't know about those estimates, he said, looking at Alakabak. We've been striving to enact better regulations for all of our workers. If that many people are falling through the cracks, then it will be up to the royal family to investigate the situation.
Some of the others began to fidget audibly, and he watched Candace lean toward Rebecca to say something to her, but she held up her hand and Candace backed off. It looked as though she was just getting started. You know, Sheikh Zaid, Rebecca said, you keep giving us great promises in your answers, but I see now that you really have no idea what's going on. I'm willing to bet that you didn't know that thousands of mostly migrant workers live in squalid conditions right here in Sharjah. Because they are classified as migrant workers, they are beyond the reach of your Labor Board's regulations. Dozens of these workers were deported for protesting their squalid conditions. As Rebecca talked, Zaid could hear the other members of the tour grumble louder, as some began to talk amongst themselves. Looking around, he was surprised to see that 2 of them had pulled out their cell phones and were recording their interaction. Alakabak stepped up to address her accusations. Claims made on behalf of undocumented migrant workers are hard to prove precisely because they are undocumented, he said. UAE law provides for penalties against companies who use too many migrant workers. We take these claims very seriously, specifically because of the work each emirate has done to ensure the safety and well-being of our workforce. I currently oversee investigations into migrant complaints here in Sharjah, and so far my team of Labor Board investigators has only been able to prove a handful of claims. Those employees have faced hefty fines and increased scrutiny because of their labor violations. Zaid couldn't believe what Rebecca had claimed. He felt comforted by Alakabak's response, but he was still concerned over the numbers Rebecca had thrown out. He looked around the room, and it seemed that everyone else was glad to accept the advisor's rebuttal and calmed down. After being called out in front of the group, Zaid didn't feel much like taking them on a tour of the facilities. The sheikh half-heartedly led the diplomatic tour through the facilities at the complex, showing them the state-of-the-art conference rooms and fitness facilities, bracing himself for another of Rebecca's tirades about the flaws with the conference center. Fortunately, they never came. If anything, she seemed to be avoiding him. When lunchtime finally rolled around, he led the group to the cafeteria where they could choose what they wanted to eat from several different food-serving stations. Once the group sat down with their meals, he walked by Rebecca and tapped her arm, staring down at her. "Uh-oh, I think I'm in trouble," she teased, drawing laughter from the other delegates at her table. Zaid didn't bother to reply and simply continued walking past the table, knowing she would follow. He stepped into the hallway outside the cafeteria and waited for her. A few moments later, he saw her petite frame emerge from the cafeteria. She wore a suit with pants instead of a skirt today. Watching her walk his way, he kicked himself for being mad at her. He didn't want to be angry with her, though after the way she'd run from him the night before, it was hard not to be a little hurt. He wanted to whisk her away from the conference center and take her back to his quarters at the palace. He wanted to forget her challenges to his authority, but he couldn't forget, and he couldn't keep letting it slide. He also couldn't keep ignoring what she was trying to tell him. He trusted her more than he did Alakabak, and as soothing as Alakabak's answers were, Rebecca's words were starting to get through to him. The numbers and reports were starting to make him realize that there was a problem beyond the reach of the Labor Board and their regulations. "I'm not going to apologize, if that's what you want," Rebecca said as soon as she approached him.
"I'm not looking for an apology," he insisted. "What I'm looking for is some respect."
"You've got to work for that, Zaid," she said. "You don't earn it by default just because you're one of the Sheikhs of Sharjah. Not in today's world. In today's world, Zaid, your actions earn respect." He narrowed his eyes at her.
"What I mean is that I want you to stop attacking me in public. You could have brought those figures to me in private. You've had ample opportunity when you could have done so instead of choosing to make it public," he said.
"Would you have listened? You can't simply ignore what is going on outside the palace walls and assume that everything is okay based on some monthly reports you might receive. Those migrant workers are being mistreated right under your nose, and if you don't fix their problems, they will eventually come to fix you." She placed a hand on his arm. "Believe it or not, Zaid, I don't want to see that happen. By helping these people, you will help your family continue to prosper here in Sharjah."
"And I keep telling you that we're trying to help by investing in those sections of Sharjah where people are suffering."
He'd been thinking about the investments in Rajak and Timina a lot since Rebecca had brought them up. They'd already pumped a lot of money into those neighborhoods. They should have been doing much better than it seemed they were.
He added, "The investments we need won't happen if we run the investors off by talking about the people who fall through the cracks, the ones who aren't supported by the laws. Our only hope to fix what's wrong with those people is to lift them back up through the cracks, back to the surface, so to speak."
"You're going to be angry with me for what I'm about to say, Zaid," Rebecca told him. "Not once have you mentioned sharing any of the Sultan's money to help these people. You could pay to improve infrastructure and housing in the short term while you work to bring in more jobs for the long term, and that could potentially drag them out of poverty ahead of schedule."
Zaid laughed. "We didn't introduce prosperity to the emirate at large by sharing royal money. We introduced foreign investors and foreign companies. As the jobs came in and the Labor Board issued protections for registered workers, the wealth of the average Emirati grew immensely. We will only continue that work by introducing more jobs for the rest of our people."
"Then do it," she challenged. "Show these people why you need their investments and their jobs. Show them what would happen over here if you didn't have a way to pay workers or provide benefits. Show them why foreign money has helped more than the Sultan's money. That is, unless you think there is something wrong with the way you've been doing it." She cocked an eyebrow at him.
"I'll make a deal with you, Rebecca,"
Zaid finally said. "Uh-oh, I don't like the sound of this," she said.
"No, it's a good deal. If you stop derailing the tour in front of the delegates visiting us, I will take you on a personal private tour of Rajak and Timina. I will show you what we've done to help and how much work remains to be done," he said.
It sounded like a reasonable solution to him, and despite the way the previous night had ended, despite what she'd done today, he still wanted to spend time with her. She didn't even hesitate before flashing him that wide, gorgeous smile of hers. "I'll do it," Rebecca said, holding out a small hand for him to shake. He took her hand and fought the urge to pull her to him and forget all that they had just talked about. He wanted to get lost in her red hair and her blue eyes. He wanted to tour her body instead of the poor sections of Sharjah. But he'd already agreed. Chapter 9. They returned to the cafeteria at the conference center. As lunch drew to a close, Zaid stood up in front of the group.
"Thank you again for joining us here today at the Sharjah Sports Complex and Conference Center. I hope this illustrates for you the types of things we're trying to do for our community and for the companies who wish to do business here. Now, Alakabak is going to accompany you to the newest holiday resort in Sharjah. The only reason you aren't staying there is that it was booked solid for the first 3 years before it opened."
Dark-haired Candace, the lead representative, who apparently thought she had a chance with Zaid, raised her hand to speak. "Where will you be, Sheikh Zaid?"
"Palace business. I will see all of you later."
That response seemed to satisfy the group, but Rebecca knew there was more to it. She fervently hoped that by touring Rajak and Timina, he would finally see that there was much to do there. As the group left with Alakabak for the resort, Zaid motioned for Rebecca to remain. "What? I don't get to see the resort too?" she teased.
"And have you start questioning the workers to find out their migrant status? No. We have our own tour to conduct. Come."
Standing, Rebecca walked with him back to the front of the complex, where she found 3 black SUVs waiting with their engines running. Guiding her to the middle vehicle, a security guard stepped out of the passenger side to hold the door open for them. Rebecca sat silently next to Zaid as they drove out to Timina. She watched as the nice, modern architecture of Sharjah turned ugly. She could tell as soon as they were in Timina. It was as if they'd crossed a line. On one side, everything was clean, new, and expensive. On the other side, the old buildings and the people lingering on the streets in front of them looked worn down and crumbling. Rebecca had known what they might see, but Zaid had acted like he didn't believe this kind of poverty existed in Sharjah. He lived in a palace. He worked with businessmen and within the confines of the government. He probably believed they were doing great things through the labor board and through investments into the community. But while the laws they wrote worked wonders for many citizens in the emirate, there were people still beyond their reach. Rebecca wanted him to see those people and to wake up to the all-too-real problems facing many workers in Sharjah. Zaid's reaction to the striking picture of poverty before them was even more dramatic than she had expected. Not long after they entered Timina, he turned to her with tears in his eyes.
"Where do they all come from?"
he asked her, his voice barely above a whisper. People wandered the streets aimlessly while others sat in doorways. Women were cooking outside over fires. And the children. Even Rebecca caught her breath at seeing so many children, and none of them were playing. It was as though they'd forgotten how, or never learned.
"Stop the car," he ordered the driver. "Stop and let us out."
The driver pulled into the parking lot of a small, closed restaurant and let them out. They were flanked by 2 armed security guards, while others seemed to disappear into the crowds of unwashed.
"Just in case we run into any more guys like we saw in Rajak," he told her. "But we're going to take the streets. I want to see what's going on here. I don't want to look at it from the safety of the SUV. Let's go."
The people they passed ignored them as if they weren't even there, which gave Zaid the opportunity to stare at them. Rebecca watched as he moved slowly down the street. They passed a young mother, walking with her 2 small children. They were carrying bags from the souk, but it was evident from their malnourished condition that there wasn't enough in the bags to feed them for more than a meal, although Rebecca suspected that the mother would strive to make what meager food they had last to the end of the week.
"I don't understand how it could be this bad," Zaid said in protest. "We've pumped so much money into Timina over the years. It doesn't make sense. Funds have been put aside for revitalization projects. We've tried to foster business growth, but looking around, I don't see any of that."
"Where does the money go exactly?" Rebecca asked. "Is there a person or committee that handles the money for projects in Timina?"
"Alakabak," Zaid said. "In fact, he is in charge of both Rajak and Timina."
"Well, it's hardly my place, Zaid. But it looks like you need to start checking where that money is going if it's not making it where it's supposed to be," Rebecca told him.
"I'm starting to think you're right," he agreed.
"I've known it for some time that I was right. That was one of the reasons I agreed to take the assignment when they offered it to me. My goal was to get whoever was heading the tour to listen to me on this and start making some real changes." They came up to a girl sitting on the side of the street crying over a spot on her knee. "Hold on," Rebecca said, pulling a couple of bandages out of her bag and kneeling down next to the little girl.
"What are you doing?" Zaid asked her. "She might need medical attention," he told her. "We can get someone here to take care of her."
"It's okay," she told the girl while Zaid tried to talk her out of helping. "I'm here to help. You don't listen to him, okay? He doesn't know what's wrong with you," she told the little girl in Arabic. She looked back up at Zaid. "It's just a scrape. If we clean it off really well and put a bandage on it, she'll be fine." She turned her attention back to the girl and pulled some antiseptic spray out of her bag. "This is going to be cold, okay? But once that wears off, it won't hurt anymore." She sprayed a light layer over the girl's knee and gently placed a bandage over it. She ran a hand through the girl's dirty, matted, dark hair before helping her to stand up. "Feel better?" The girl nodded solemnly. "Then go. But be careful." She watched as the little girl tested her legs before running off down the street.
"Your Arabic is better than the last time we were together," Zaid told her.
"I wanted Caleum to know it, so I kept my language classes up."
"So he speaks Arabic?"
Nodding her head, yes. "He's learning. There's a mosque not too far away, and the imam's wife has been giving him lessons along with their sons." They continued walking in silence. Rebecca watched him to look at everything. His face seemed pensive, and she wasn't sure what he was thinking. His father had come under the watchful eye of more than one human rights organization for the lengthy list of complaints from the migrant workers who both lived and worked in Sharjah. When she was asked to come on this tour, she had made sure to study all the files she could access. She had been shocked to find out how rampant it was in such a small area. It was as if their poverty supported all of the other wealth in the emirate. "One of the problems I wanted to bring up is the water in Timina," she said. Zaid stopped walking and looked at her.
"How is it that you know more about what's wrong in Sharjah than I do?"
he asked her. There was no humor in his voice. He was truly concerned with how out of touch he'd become. "It's my job, Zaid. I study places like these and help people in power figure out how to fix it so that it doesn't become a political problem. You know, I help you avoid the torches and pitchforks." Zaid grimaced as he took in the sewage in the gutter on the other side of the street.
"What about the water?"
"You should have received a copy of the water sanitation report from the UN water program. The scientists that came through here 2 years ago reported broken pipes and unsafe levels of toxins in the drinking supply." She was about to continue, but a cloud passed over his face as he turned to her.
"First, I need to find out why Timina is crumbling while the rest of the emirate is growing and progressing."
She could tell by his tone that he was angry, and she was glad it wasn't directed at him. "What about the water? Some of your poorest Emiratis don't have safe drinking water. What are you going to do about it?" she asked insistently.
"I will need to get a copy of that report and have someone look into it. In the meantime, we can bring in water trucks. Since this is not something that we can resolve overnight, we will have to look into temporary solutions until more permanent ones can be found."
Rebecca felt a smile spread across her face. Given everything she had read in the reports, she was surprised at how quickly Zaid was to jump into action. She just hoped that his enthusiasm to make things right wouldn't be short-lived. "But will you keep this concern up after the tour goes home, or once more money has been invested in the growth of Sharjah?" Turning to glare at her.
"Why would you even ask me something like that? You have gotten my attention, which was what you wanted, and now I intend to do something about it. All this," he finished as he gestured to the cracked and crumbling buildings.
Hearing a small motor, they both watched what might have once been a motorcycle cruise slowly past them. The rider had 2 small children, one in front and the other in back, holding tightly to him as he rode past. Shaking his head, he watched them go by.
"Something is very wrong here, and I intend to find out what happened."
His deep, commanding voice stirred the desire she'd tried to ignore all day. She wanted to distance herself from him on a personal level and maintain professionalism around him, but it was hard to do when she started seeing how much he truly cared, as opposed to the clueless sheik who hid inside the palace and pretended these problems didn't exist. Chapter 10. Upon returning to the palace, Zaid escorted Rebecca to his private quarters again, while he made several phone calls to start an investigative probe into the problems in Rajak and Timina. He wanted to know where the money was going, where the jobs were, and just how it was that so many problems had been overlooked for so long. He handed the job over to the same contact who was looking into the Sultan's chief advisor. He felt it was only fitting, since Alakabak was supposed to oversee both areas. He briefly contemplated speaking with his father about his suspicions, but Alakabak was a trusted member of his father's staff, and he would need to have considerable evidence against him before his father would listen. He then called to order the water trucks and was assured that they could begin delivering water as early as that evening. When he finally finished his calls, he walked into the bedroom to find Rebecca sleeping on his bed. She'd removed her suit jacket and stretched out on the bed in her white dress shirt with the first 2 buttons open, showing off the ivory skin that almost matched her shirt, and her dress slacks having already kicked off her shoes. He stared at her, remembering kissing that skin, pinning her petite body beneath him and kissing every delicious inch of it. He'd been gentle with her initially, taking his time and taking care of her, as if she had been a piece of fine china that he didn't want to break, but he remembered the way she'd asked him to stop being so gentle. "You won't break me," she'd said. "I'm a big girl." Every time he got close to her, his mind drifted back to that night. Now, sitting with her on the bed, he felt the magnetic attraction between them. The last night they were together, the night, she'd told him she was his, that he was all she wanted, and he caught himself staring at her now, wondering if she'd managed to keep that absurd promise. He wondered if she'd slept with anyone else since their son had been born, but it wasn't his place to ask those kinds of questions. So he just stared and let his imagination have its way with both of them. Then there was a knock at the door. They both jumped off the bed as if they were teenagers caught together. Rebecca threw her jacket back on quickly and walked into the living room behind Zaid as he went to open the door. Zaid cracked the door open to find 3 people standing there. Hazim, the head of security, a woman who, from her red hair and blue eyes, could only be Rebecca's younger sister Amy, and peeking around her was Caleum, his son. In that moment, the world stood still. The photograph didn't do Caleum any justice. The child standing before him was so much more than what the picture had been able to capture, but it was still like looking in a child-sized mirror. His son's features looked the same as his own. He saw in Caleum's dark eyes a hint of recognition as he, too, realized he was looking at someone who bore a striking resemblance to himself. Rebecca gasped behind him and ran to their son, embracing him in the doorway and throwing an arm around her sister.
"Thank you, Hazim,"
Zaid said to the security guard. Hazim simply nodded and turned to leave. "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" Rebecca cried out to her sister and their son. "Zaid had us flown out here," Amy said. "He insisted." Rebecca stood up and turned around behind Caleum. She narrowed her eyes in anger at Zaid. "I told you no," she growled lowly before kneeling down behind her son. "Caleum, honey," she said slowly, patiently, "I want you to meet someone very special." As Caleum looked at her with interest, she turned him around to face Zaid. "This is your dad, Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi." Caleum looked back up at Zaid, with his tiny eyes fixed on his father's. "Sheikh?" he asked. "Sheikh Dad?"
"How about just Dad?"
Zaid answered, kneeling down in front of him. Zaid held out his arms for his son to hug him, and as they embraced, he had to fight back tears from all the time he'd missed with his boy. His son hugged him tight, as if he felt the exact same emotions that were surging through Zaid at the moment. Zaid broke their embrace and sat back to look at his son. He was suddenly extremely proud. He looked up at Amy and Rebecca, standing in front of him and looking down at him where he'd just been hugging Caleum. Neither one of them seemed too pleased with him, but he didn't care. Meeting his son for the first time trumped anything else that was going on at the moment.
"What's this?"
Zaid asked, as Caleum pulled his arms back from their embrace to show his father the two action figures he had in his hands.
"Are these your toys?"
he asked. Caleum nodded solemnly.
"These are neat. Can we play with them?"
Caleum nodded again.
"Excellent. Well, let's come in."
He stood up and gestured for everyone to enter his quarters. The sister followed, letting the door close behind them. Zaid walked with his son over to the couch, where they sat and started playing with the action figures he'd brought with him.
"You brought these guys all the way from home?"
Zaid asked.
"Yes, sir,"
Caleum said politely.
"That's cool,"
he told his son.
"So you had no idea we were coming?"
Amy asked, as the sisters sat at the small table near the kitchen.
"No idea at all,"
Rebecca admitted, making no effort to hide how angry she was at Zaid for not telling her he'd had them flown out behind her back.
"I told him I didn't want Caleum here."
"Why not?" Amy asked, looking from one to the other.
"It's long past time that Caleum knows about his father."
Amy had made her opinions known on whether Zaid should have been told of Caleum's existence from the moment Rebecca told her who he was, but now was not the time for her sister to side with Zaid.
"There is potential for unrest in some of the poor sections of Sharjah. I don't want Caleum around if anything happens," Rebecca argued.
She closed her eyes and counted to 10 while she caught her sister rolling her eyes at her.
"Judging from the amount of security around here, I don't think there will be any difficulties protecting him," Amy countered. "Not everything is worst-case scenario simply because people live in poverty." "You haven't seen what I've seen, Amy," she insisted. "If you had, you'd be concerned too."
"Maybe," Amy admitted.
"But look at them."
She nodded to Caleum and Zaid playing on the couch. She watched as Zaid and Caleum sat with their heads together. Her son lifted his head and smiled at her, as Zaid whispered something in his ear, making him laugh that little boy laugh that always made her heart beat harder with love for her little man. The Zaid who sat in front of her now, with their son, was a far cry from the business-minded Zaid she'd come to know. He was gentle and caring. He laughed with their son while they played. He talked in silly voices. He let Caleum call the shots while they were playing. It was an amazing transformation, and it happened right before her eyes. She wouldn't have believed it any other way. She was still furious with him for bringing both Caleum and Amy to Sharjah without her permission, but a part of her knew that if the situation were reversed, she would have done the same. Seeing the way he was with their son, she began to have other feelings deeper and stronger than anger. She realized the dad her son had been missing, the father Caleum would have had all along, if she'd reached out to Zaid. She had been too proud to admit that her family upbringing had made it difficult for her to accept that Zaid would be a good father, or that Caleum could have a normal childhood with both parents involved.
"Hey, Mom," Amy teased, "you should get in there and play with them too. They look like they could use a woman's touch. I don't know," she hesitated. "He needs some time with his father. This is the first time they've ever even seen each other in person." "And why is that?" Amy asked in an accusing tone. "Why did you keep them apart for so long?" "You know why I didn't want them to meet," she reminded her sister. "Listen," Amy insisted in the Sheikh's private quarters. "Regardless of what your reasons were, they are together now, and you owe it to both of them, and to yourself, to be a part of it." She pushed her sister. "It's so obvious how much you still care for Zaid. Do you really want to give that up? Now get over there and act like that's your family. Because it is."
Rebecca gave in and sat on the couch on the other side of their son.
"Do you guys mind if I join in?" she asked.
"Uh-oh,"
Zaid said through the action figure in his hand.
"Mommy's onto us, kid. We have to hide."
The boys laughed and moved their action figures to hide them. As soon as the toys were out of the way, Zaid looked at Rebecca and said,
"We're fine now. What's up?"
She'd never seen that look on his face, the utter happiness he seemed to be feeling with his son there next to him. He was glowing as he gave her a silly smile. "I just wanted to know if I could play," Rebecca said. Zaid looked at Caleum, who was hiding his action figure behind his back, and asked the boy,
"What do you think? Should we let your mother in?" he asked.
Caleum nodded with a big smile, and the three started playing together. Rebecca began to realize what she had been missing as well. She saw before her the opportunity to finally have a real family. Chapter 11. After Caleum and Zaid played together for a while and the excitement of it all began to wear off a bit, Rebecca noticed Caleum start rubbing his eyes. When he snatched his action figures back from Zaid and refused to play any more, Rebecca decided it was time to cut things short. "Kiddo," Rebecca said, "it looks like it is somebody's bedtime. Are you feeling tired?" "Uh-huh," Caleum said with a little whine to his voice and nodded his head. Zaid scooped him up in his big arms.
"He can sleep in my bed,"
Zaid whispered. "That'll be fine," Rebecca agreed. "I'm feeling pooped too," Amy chimed in. "I can stay here with him while you two go grab a bite to eat. I imagine you have a lot to talk about after today." Rebecca cocked an eyebrow at Zaid. "We do," she agreed.
"A lot," Zaid added. "Are you sure you don't mind?" he asked Amy.
"Not at all. We have this down, don't we, kiddo?" she asked as she reached to rub his back. "We'll be fine." She looked around the Sheikh's quarters. "Besides, this is like an apartment. You've got everything I could possibly need in here."
"And you can call us," Zaid added, "if you need anything. Please, don't hesitate."
Rebecca watched as Zaid carried Caleum to his bedroom with Amy to help them get situated. When he came back out, he looked at her.
"Just to make it easy, you want to go up to the terrace again?" he asked.
She smiled. "I'd love to." Once they reached the rooftop terrace, Zaid took out his phone and called the palace chef. They ordered food and wine and talked while they waited.
"He's big,"
Zaid said. Rebecca laughed. "What did you expect? He's 4.
"Yeah, but I always imagined meeting my son while he was an infant. I never imagined meeting a child of mine after he was already that old."
She felt a pang of regret. "I'm really sorry," she told Zaid. "I panicked and didn't know what to do. You know, what we had back then was great, and I would have loved for it to last, but at the end of the day, the simple fact remained that our lifestyles were not compatible. You're royalty. You're the Sheikh, for crying out loud. And I'm an activist of sorts. I'm out there every day trying to help people fix problems like oppression and poverty. The two don't exactly go hand in hand, you know?"
"But they can," Zaid suggested. "We've already seen that here, with you helping to point out what's wrong in Sharjah so that I can fix it."
"I was afraid you were going to say that," she said with a nervous laugh. "And I'm still angry with you for going behind my back and bringing Caleum here. He is much too young to be drawn into any of this, and Amy, Rebecca couldn't finish that sentence. What if something had happened to the plane? Or worse? She didn't even want to contemplate what would be worse than a plane crash.
"You're right. It was thoughtless of me. I apologize."
The wine arrived just in time to distract them from the conversation. After the first few sips, Rebecca looked at Zaid, sitting there and staring at his wine as if he were contemplating the meaning of life itself. "You know," she said, "I did want to visit the resort."
"Really? That's surprising," Zaid commented. "I figured you would have found something wrong with it and why we needed to shut it down."
Rebecca laughed. "No, in fact, it was the only touristy part of the tour I was looking forward to. I even bought a bikini for it," she teased.
"Is that so?" he asked.
He reached across the table and took her hand.
"Well, you can always model it for me later," he said, playing along.
"Who said I'm not wearing it under my suit?" He raised his eyebrows.
"Are you serious?"
"Wouldn't you like to know?" He squeezed her hand.
"Come on,"
he said quietly, urgently, as he got up from the table.
"What about dinner?" she asked. "Our food hasn't arrived and we still haven't talked."
"They'll box it and send it down to my quarters. Let's go hit the pool. We can eat later."
She felt a rush as he pulled her by her hand down the stairs from the terrace to the palace pool, which was located in a secluded area, almost fully enclosed with rock walls that screened it from any of the palace windows. The pool's back deck faced the water behind the palace, and no one was out there. When they reached the pool, Zaid quickly stripped off his robe and left his headpiece on the deck next to the water. He stood naked before her, the contours of his muscles just as she remembered them. She wanted to touch him, to feel him above her again. She fumbled with the buttons of her shirt until Zaid grabbed it and pulled it over her head, revealing that she was not, in fact, wearing her bikini underneath. She'd just been teasing.
"Oops," she said playfully. "I guess I forgot my bikini after all."
Sorry, readers. Here's where we fade to black due to YouTube explicit content guidelines. If you dream for the steam, you'll need to take a look in the book.
Still holding her against him, he whispered,
"You're mine now,"
in her ear.
"I always have been," she whispered back, and they kissed again.
Her fingers twisted into his hair, and his hands held her face delicately, their kiss as ravenous for one another as if they hadn't just made love. He wrapped his arms around her, cradling her as they kissed. This was what she'd been missing. No one else had ever made love to her the way he did. And it was love. It wasn't some physical one-nighter. It was the real deal. He's always taken care of her in bed, and in the pool it had been no different.
"Stay with me tonight,"
he whispered.
"Are you sure?"
Her blue eyes met his, almost black.
"I am,"
he said, and he kissed her again. Chapter 12. The next morning, while Zaid and Rebecca were getting ready to meet the rest of the tour at the American factory in Timina, Caleum shuffled into the bathroom behind his dad.
"Where are you going?"
he asked.
"I'm taking your mother and some of her co-workers to check out a factory run by an American company nearby,"
Zaid answered.
"I want to come."
Zaid's eyes leveled on his son's Arabian face in the bathroom mirror.
"You do?"
he asked. He was touched by Caleum's interest.
"Yes, sir," the boy said. "I want to be with you."
"It's fine with me as long as it's okay with your mother,"
Zaid told him.
"As long as what's fine with me?"
Rebecca asked, coming into the bathroom to put on her jewelry.
"Caleum wants to accompany us this morning as we go to the factory in Timina,"
Zaid replied.
"Do you think it's safe?" she asked.
"Of course it's safe," Zaid insisted.
Besides, one day, all of this may be his responsibility. Think about that.
Only if you ask me to marry you, Rebecca fired back. Oh, and if I accept.
She shot him a look in the mirror and ducked back out of the bathroom. Zaid looked at his son and shrugged.
I'll take that as a yes. How about you?
His face lit up.
I'm going?
Only if you get your aunt to help you get dressed while your mother and I finish getting ready, he said.
Awesome,
he shouted, running into the living room to wake Amy, who'd slept on the couch. The three of them, Zaid, Rebecca, and Caleum, were waiting in front of the factory when the rest of the delegates showed up. While Rebecca had tried to get Amy to come with them, she happily bowed out, telling them she would much rather catch up on some much-needed sleep. Candace climbed out of the coach first and walked up to greet them.
"Is this your son?"
she asked the two of them. Zaid shot Rebecca a look, unsure of what exactly to say.
"My son, yes,"
Rebecca answered. Candace looked between Caleum and Zaid.
"You two are spitting images of each other. It's uncanny. If I didn't know you, I'd say he looks like your son, and the three of you make a wonderful family."
Zaid and Rebecca laughed. Zaid ruffled his son's thick black hair.
"Thank you,"
he said with a smile, as the other delegates and security detail caught up with them to go into the factory.
"Where's your advisor, Alakabak?"
Rebecca asked, looking around the group.
He left a message that he had been otherwise detained and we were to go without him."
Zaid didn't want to raise any concerns with Rebecca. She was too worried about everything anyway.
"I'm presuming he had urgent business with my father. Since he filled in for me on 2 afternoons, it's my turn," he finished with a smile.
So many thoughts swirled in the back of Zaid's mind as they walked into the factory, and he stepped away from Rebecca to the front of the group. He hadn't considered anyone pointing out the resemblance between them so quickly, and he was sure word would get back to his father faster than he was prepared to deal with. Given the unorthodox nature of his brother's relationships with their now wives, he was less concerned about any repercussions from his father and more concerned with his disappointment. Granted, this information in the wrong hands could make for some bad press. Alakabak's absence at least bought him some time before his father found out about Caleum. He was worried about the migrant workers they were probably going to find inside. The factory was in Timina, after all, one of the migrant worker centers of Sharjah. All Rebecca's arguments about worker conditions in Rajak and Timina echoed in his head. With a bolt of clarity, he realized the combination of the working conditions and underpaid migrant workers would probably make the factory look like a sweatshop to his guests. Then, in a moment of brilliance, he decided to make it as positive as he could. He would show them that conditions like these were why they still needed new businesses and new investments in the region, just as he'd told Rebecca the day before. His people had to be brought out of poverty, and the government couldn't do it by any means other than helping them obtain better jobs. Tourism and a strong local economy would help all of them. It was the only way.
"This is what we're working with here in Timina," he said as a way of introduction. "We have a lot of low-wage workers doing jobs like these. This factory, owned by an American manufacturer, is the largest employer in this area. Now, as Ms. Reed can tell you, many migrant workers here earn wages considerably lower than our citizens and have little to no benefits. And while there are fines for hiring too many migrant workers, it can be difficult to police given that the majority of migrants are undocumented. We have put a lot of effort into not allowing this sort of thing to happen, with mixed success."
He looked around at the touring delegates and took a deep breath.
"I originally wanted to show you all the glitz and the glamour of Sharjah. You've seen that by now, but there is a flip side to that coin, which is why we are striving to attract bigger, better, and more successful companies. We want to provide our hard-working labor force with better jobs so that they can attain a secure lifestyle. We have laws against subpar working conditions, including poor wages and benefits for that reason. Here in Sharjah, we believe that our workforce deserves to make a decent living, no matter where they are in the company, whether they are at the top, the bottom, or anywhere in between."
As he talked, he tried to gauge the reactions of the investors and was pleased to see interest in what he had to say. Casting a glance toward Rebecca, he was relieved to see her smiling at him. As the tour shifted back outside, he continued,
"This factory has been in operation for 5 years, and I can honestly say that this is an example of what we are working against. While we appreciate the jobs, we need companies that won't abuse our workforce by taking advantage of them."
He hadn't wanted to point out the negative, but he also realized that if they're going to make changes in Sharjah, honesty and transparency in some issues was necessary. He wished that he had the findings of the investigations he ordered so he could understand how it had gotten so bad, but he also needed to tell his investors why Sharjah needed their help. As he opened his mouth to say more, an explosion at the outer end of the factory shook the ground where they were standing. Suddenly they were surrounded by members of the security detail. "Sheikh Zaid," one of the guards shouted, "get down!" There was another blast. The air was filled with smoke and the screams of delegates. Everywhere Zaid looked, there were people running, most of them delegates headed for the coach that had brought them here. Zaid took off running too, searching for Rebecca and Caleum. He had just caught sight of a flash of red hair at the rear of the crowd running toward the parking area when the third blast hit and the front of the building erupted into flames. The sound was deafening, and the sheik ducked as debris blasted around him. He heard Rebecca scream. The 2 security guards who'd been following him fell silent as if they'd been swallowed by the dust that choked the air. He didn't hear Caleum either. He feared the worst. He'd just met his son for the first time. He couldn't lose him now. Not like this. Not this soon.
"Caleum!"
he shouted.
"Caleum!
There was no answer.
Caleum!"
He shouted again, peering desperately through the settling dust to find his son. After what felt like an eternity but could only have been a matter of seconds, he saw a man walking away leading Caleum by the hand. Relieved to see that Caleum appeared okay, he rushed toward them, still unable to hear properly. Grabbing Caleum's free hand, he scooped the little boy into his arms, nodding briefly to the man before turning to look for Rebecca. Calling out her name, he looked down to reassure his son and saw blood running down his cheek. "Oh, shit," Zaid muttered as he held him tightly in his arms. "Rebecca!" he called out again. "Zaid?" He heard her calling for him. She sounded scared and panicked in the dead silence following the blast. They ran into each other in the gray dust, and she screamed when she saw Caleum. "What are we going to do?" she cried out to Zaid as soon as she saw the blood. "What did they do to my son?" she asked.
"I don't know," Zaid told her, "but we are going to get him to a hospital. Now."
When they got back to the cars, Zaid could see that the guests were climbing into the coach, frazzled but mostly fine.
"If anyone needs a doctor," he shouted, "follow us. We're heading to the hospital."
He flung open the back door of the Mercedes and waited for Rebecca to slide in before handing her Caleum. Looking around for the driver, he didn't see him anywhere. Swearing, he slammed the door shut before shifting around to the front and climbing into the driver's seat. Starting the car, he threw it in gear and made a hard turn, shooting sand and dirt up behind them as he hit the gas pedal too hard before heading for the road. A million frantic thoughts rushed through his mind as he drove. Where were his security guards? Where was Alakabak? Who did this? Why did they do it? Was the palace okay? Oh God, was anyone inside hurt? Or worse, was Caleum going to be okay? What about Rebecca?
"Hold on,"
he yelled as he drove. Looking in the rearview mirror, he watched Rebecca cuddle Caleum against her. Assuming that any member of his security detail was able, news of the blast will have reached his father and brothers by now. At the very least, emergency services will be able to treat the wounded. His first priority, however, was making sure Caleum and Rebecca were okay, and he wouldn't have that answer until after they were seen at the hospital. Looking in his side mirror, he caught sight of the coach rapidly catching up with them. Good. At least he'd keep everyone together. In the back seat, Rebecca murmured over and over, "You're going to be fine, Caleum. You're going to be just fine."
"Are you okay back there?"
he called to Rebecca, trying to meet her eyes in the rearview mirror. "We're okay for now. I'm putting pressure on the cut, but there seems to be a lot of blood, Zaid." The panic in her voice pushed him to drive faster to the hospital, even as he said,
"Head wounds always bleed a lot, even the small ones."
In the distance, he heard the sirens of emergency personnel rushing to the factory. He stepped on the gas. If he didn't hurry, they'd be surrounded by the vehicles clogging the road trying to get to the factory. "What the hell was that, Zaid?" Rebecca asked.
"I don't know. Nothing like that has ever happened in my lifetime here. I just don't know."
Chapter 13. Rebecca cradled Caleum in her arms and rubbed his back to soothe his crying while she listened to the doctor. "While this is a minor cut," the doctor explained, "it will heal better, be less likely to scar with stitches, but there's nothing to worry about, and the stitches will come out before you know it." "Okay," Rebecca said shakily. "Is there anything else I need to do?" "Just make sure that he doesn't scratch at them. Keep the area clean, watch for redness, tenderness, signs of infection. You know, the usual. The stitches will come out on their own when they're ready." The doctor patted her on the shoulder on his way out of the room. Rebecca looked over at Zaid. He stood in the far corner of the room, watching with a guarded look on his face. "You told me it was safe. You told me we'd be safe," she wanted to yell at him. "You brought your son to this God-forsaken country against my wishes.
If she hadn't been crowded around a hospital bed, she would have shouted all this and worse, maybe pummeled him with her fists. But looking at him now, he was just as stricken by what happened as she was. Probably more so that it happened while he was there with the envoy. She couldn't imagine what was going through his mind as he fought to make sense of the chaos and violence that he experienced. At least for her, this wasn't the first time she'd been so close to bomb blasts, but it certainly didn't make it any easier, particularly since Caleum was injured. She hugged their son to her as she watched Zaid finish on the phone. She still couldn't believe how decisively he reacted, pulling them through the rubble and getting them to the car. Thankfully, the nurse in admitting recognized him as they came in. If it wasn't for him, chances were that Caleum would still be waiting to be seen in the now very busy hospital. Rebecca set Caleum back down on the bed and walked over to her Sheikh. She stroked his strong, tense arms. "How are you?" she asked him, looking up into his dark, scowling features.
"I can't believe I let this happen," he answered.
"You didn't let this happen," Rebecca argued. "Someone did this. You didn't let anything happen."
"Of course I did. You were the one worried about protecting Caleum. You warned me against bringing him here, but I didn't listen. I thought I knew better. This happened on my watch, and it should not have happened at all," Zaid continued. "I should have paid more attention. I should have seen this coming. We should have taken actions to prevent this type of thing."
"So many shoulds, Zaid. You can't blame yourself. You didn't do this. You had nothing to do with it." The anger in his face scared her, as did his silence. He was obviously angry with himself for what had happened, and she needed to get his attention off that train of thought. "Has anyone said what it was or who did it yet?" Rebecca asked.
Zaid shook his head. "All my father said was we needed to get everybody back to the palace as soon as we're all checked out."
"Well, I think we're ready to go here," Rebecca said.
"Good,"
Zaid said, his voice tight, as if he were barely keeping himself in check.
"I'll check on everyone else so we can get back to the palace."
Rebecca hated to see him go, felt less safe once the door closed behind him, but she'd agreed. He did need to check on the other delegates, the factory workers. They were his responsibility, but that didn't mean she had to like it. It was an eternity before he came back, his face still clouded. Caleum had finally calmed down and nearly stopped crying. He quieted more when Zaid put a hand on his son's back.
"Ready to go, kiddo?"
he asked, his eyes on Rebecca the whole time. "Yes, sir," Caleum sniffled. Sitting on the bed, he rubbed the back of Caleum's head, waiting for the little boy to look at him.
"You just survived a terrorist attack, and you've got stitches. I'll let you in on a little secret. Girls like stitches and scars and things like that. It shows them you're tougher than whatever tried to hurt you," Zaid told him.
"Yeah, I guess," he sniffled loudly.
"You know what? Here."
Zaid scooped Caleum up from the bed and held him to his shoulder.
"I got you, and I will never, ever let anyone hurt you again. Understand?"
Nodding his head solemnly. "Thank you." Caleum put his short arms around Zaid's neck and held him tight. Zaid dropped Rebecca and Caleum off in his personal quarters and into the tearful arms of Amy. She'd heard the bombing from the palace, but had been left in the dark as to what happened. Sitting in his office, he made the remainder of his calls, including to the hotel, to have the personal effects of all the members of the envoy brought to the palace, where they were now staying. He had barely hung up the phone when his security detail knocked at the door, ready to take him to meet with his father, his brothers, and Hazim, the head of security.
"I trust everyone is okay,"
the Sultan asked Zaid as soon as he entered his father's conference room.
"Yes, sir," Zaid answered. "The envoy was brought to the hospital and all have been released. They are here at the palace now. I think we lost a couple of security guards in the chaos, but that information hasn't been forthcoming." "That's a shame," the Sultan replied, his frown deepening. "I'm sorry to hear that."
He shook his head. Zaid had never seen his father look so troubled.
"We've already had a small debriefing with the diplomatic envoy," Hazim informed the Sultan. "Okay, good," he said. He looked around the room.
suddenly speechless. Ahmed and Khalid were both fuming as they stood with their hands behind their backs, listening to the reports as they came in.
"What do we know?"
Zaid asked sternly.
"The authorities are calling it an act of terrorism," his father said. "That much is obvious. We were there when it happened," Zaid told his father. "There were 3 separate explosions. Have the authorities said anything about bombs or explosives?" "They haven't released any real information yet," the Sultan told him. "Just that they are opening a formal investigation and have started gathering evidence." "And where is Alakabak?" Zaid said. "He's at the scene of the apparent attack with the investigators," the Sultan said.
"Of course he is." Zaid simply nodded, except that he wasn't there when the blast hit. Hazim chimed in. "I've increased security around the palace, including regular patrols in teams of 4 instead of 2. All cameras are operational and we are checking all vehicles before they enter the grounds. But as of right now, we are secure. We're safe."
"Great," said the Sultan. "Now, I need a moment alone with my sons. We have other matters to discuss in the midst of this disaster."
"Yes, sir." Hazim nodded and left the room. Once the door was closed, the Sultan pulled a chair back from the table and sat down. He looked troubled and tired, as if the weight of these events simply compounded matters that were already bothering him.
"It's time, Zaid," he said. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't follow. Time for what?" Zaid asked. He and his brothers pulled out chairs and sat down. "It's time for you to marry." "Father, now is not the time to discuss me getting married. Not in the midst of all this chaos," Zaid argued. "Stability. That's what the people need right now, and a royal wedding is just the kind of thing people will want to see," the Sultan continued. "It's something to celebrate, something that brings people together, unifies them, something that could restore their faith in the Al-Qasimi family. Right now there are probably many people who do not feel safe after the attack, but we can fix that with a wedding. A big, beautiful public spectacle with lots of guests. No disrespect intended, Father, but that is the worst idea. What the people want to see is what we are doing to keep them safe." Zaid looked to his brothers, who nodded at him encouragingly. "To spend so much money on a public spectacle will only fuel any animosity already felt toward us with this migrant issue we are dealing with." The Sultan stared at Zaid, making him feel as though he was a child again. "Now is not the time to speak to me of disrespect. Did you think I would not find out that I have another grandson hidden away in your quarters? Exactly how long did you intend to keep that information to yourself?" Zaid's stomach churned as he tried to figure out how best to respond. "Father, I can explain." The Sultan held his hand up, and Zaid went silent. Turning to look at his brothers, he couldn't tell what Khalid was thinking from the stoic expression on his face, but he detected a smirk on Ahmed's face. Turning his head slowly back toward his father, he watched his face break out in a grin. "Another grandson." Clapping his hands together. "You will marry this woman, yes?" "Yes, sir," Zaid agreed readily, although he still had to talk Rebecca into it. "Excellent. You will announce your engagement and reveal the identity of your bride at the Jaziya ball next week. The timing is perfect as it culminates with the end of the diplomatic tour. We will hold the wedding shortly after the ball, within the next few days," the Sultan continued. "Yes, sir." Zaid felt as though a huge weight had been lifted from him. "I like the sound of that. I think that would be very appropriate, and it would be a good thing for the people to see." "Indeed," the Sultan agreed. "Now, this woman, she will agree?" Zaid thought about it for a moment. "I need to talk to her about it." He worried that she would think she'd have to give up her humanitarian work while he was already envisioning how much she could help here in Sharjah. He couldn't imagine her saying no. She had promised herself to him already, had told him she was his. There was no indication that there was any doubt in her mind or heart about her feelings for him. But would she marry him? The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. This gave him an excuse finally to bring up the topic of marriage with her.
It would legitimize his son, making him an heir to the sultancy.
"Now, when do I get to meet her?"
His father interrupted his thoughts. Smiling at his father,
"The ball. Now, if you'll excuse me, father, I have a woman to talk into marrying me."
Zaid was grateful not to have to go through what his brothers had gone through with their marriages. There wasn't going to be any trial and error this time. This time, it would be a marriage, and he was going to get it right the first time. The Sultan dismissed the brothers, sending them out of the boardroom.
"Who is it?" Khalid asked. "Is it one of the women from the delegates touring Sharjah?"
"I'll tell you once she says yes,"
Zaid answered.
"I don't want to jinx it."
He smiled at his brothers and walked off on his own. One of the members of the security team came up and handed him a folder full of reports. "This is the information you requested," the young man told him before turning to leave. "What information?" Zaid opened the folder to review the file information he'd been handed. With everything that had happened, he'd forgotten about the report he'd requested on how the money for improvements in Rajah and Timina had been spent. He flipped through the pages as he walked, pausing when he came across several spreadsheets indicating where money should have gone toward infrastructure. Having now toured both neighborhoods, he knew that the money never made it there. Continuing to flip through the pages, he was surprised to see reference to a private security firm that he knew the palace didn't do business with. Despite the mounting evidence, he still didn't have enough to bring to his father. His advisor was too well entrenched, and from what Zaid was reading, had the means to mask his trail of deception and subterfuge well. "What are you up to, Alakabak?" Chapter 14. It had been 1 week since the bombings, and the authorities were tight-lipped about any speculation on who did it. Zaid had managed to find out that there had indeed been 3 separate bombs planted, and that they had gone off hours sooner than originally planned. Because of that, there were fewer injuries, and the number of fatalities had been limited to 3. But any further information was held back as the investigation continued. With the addition of security personnel and more stringent safety precautions, the diplomatic envoy continued their tour, and there was speculation that despite what happened, there were still investors interested in Sharjah. Zaid assumed that it had more to do with the authorities' swift reaction to the bombing, coupled with the obvious poverty intervention tactics the palace was taking to provide fresh water to the people of Rajah and Timina for drinking, cooking, and bathing, along with improved sanitation in those areas that were easily remedied. The Jizya ball was that night, and all of the Emirates' high society would attend, including the delegates from the diplomacy tour. Rumors were flying around that a big announcement would occur tonight, which caught the media's attention, and they were lined up outside, eager to catch a glimpse of the guests and speculate on what the announcement would be. It was one of those nights when the Sultan conveniently forgot about the restrictions he placed on alcohol in the palace. Champagne flowed as servers handed out beautiful crystal flutes filled with the sparkling drink. The palace ballroom was elaborately decorated in gold and white, giving the impression of opulence against the backdrop of the star-studded sky, which could be seen through the many doors that had been left open to the exotic Arabian landscape. The Sultan was the only person who showed up in traditional attire, and that was how he preferred it for the annual ball. It was a time to celebrate progress and prosperity. The ballroom was packed with guests eager to sample the food prepared by Ahmed's wife, Melanie, and her restaurant, which had recently won 2 awards. With the diplomatic party already present, Zaid was excited to show off the feisty little Irish-American redhead dressed in a long amethyst-colored gown with silver embroidery throughout. She was stunning, and Zaid couldn't wait for their engagement announcement.
"This is how my father parties when he wants to show off,"
he'd warned her before they left his private quarters.
"Be prepared, because it's big."
When they walked into the ballroom, they were greeted by loud music and bright lights as men and women moved to the beat of the music on the dance floor, causing Rebecca to grip his hand a little tighter. "This is not what I expected," she said in his ear.
"Oh, this is nothing. It's early,"
Zaid warned. The Sultan sat in his throne-like chair on the dais at the far end of the room from the door, watching over his grand party. Zaid's uncles sat on either side of him. They never took part in any of the balls or parties. They simply presided over it the same way they would have presided over court. His mother and aunts were seated off to the side, close enough to watch but far enough away that security could maintain a watchful eye on them. Once most of the guests had arrived and the party was finally in full swing, the Sultan stood and signaled the DJ to stop the music. It was time for the opening speech, and possibly even the wedding announcement. Zaid patted his pocket for the third time to make sure that the ring he planned to offer Rebecca was still there. In the past week, they had spent considerable time together as a family, and every minute found him more in love with both Rebecca and Caleum, so much so that he couldn't imagine his life without them. He hoped she felt the same.
"Family, friends, and other esteemed guests," the Sultan started his speech. "Welcome to the 25th Annual Jizya Ball. Every year is a celebration of our good fortune and growing prosperity. It is with regret that the recent attacks on the factory has mired our long-standing peace in this region. But it has done my heart good to know that so many of you readily donated funds to those families who were most hurt by the bombings. If you would, let's take a moment to honor those who were injured and died."
Pausing, the Sultan dropped his head, mumbling quietly to himself as others followed suit. Lifting his head, Zaid could see the sadness on his father's face before he seemed to shake it off.
"Tonight we have a special treat for everyone," he continued. "Tonight, my middle son, Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi, has asked to make an announcement of his own."
The Sultan looked around the room.
"Now, I don't know what he's going to say or do, but, as you all know, I've been marrying my sons off, so perhaps this will be his year."
He paused and waved his hand toward where Zaid stood with Rebecca. There was laughter and cheering this time, mixed with applause. Rebecca shot Zaid an apprehensive look. While they'd had several discussions on coming together as a family, she's been reticent about moving to Sharjah, and Zaid had yet to broach the subject of marriage as he had hoped to surprise her.
"So," the Sultan said when the crowd quieted, "without further ado, I'm turning it over to him."
Zaid gave Rebecca's hand a squeeze and strode to the front of the room to stand on the edge of the dais.
"Friends and family gathered with us tonight," he started. "As you all know, I am the remaining brother who has yet to take a bride. My brothers, Khalid and Ahmed, have already married their beautiful brides. Now it's my turn, and it is my hope that you will be as entranced with her as I am."
He looked at Rebecca. She was already beginning to blush. She knew what was coming.
"Rebecca Reed," he said, holding out his hand, "can you please approach the dais?"
She walked up slowly, nervously. Zaid met her halfway, taking her hand to escort her up onto the miniature stage. He grinned as he stepped down.
"I have to do it this way so it looks right when I kneel,"
he told the guests, and their laughter filled the room, easing his nerves a bit. Rebecca looked down at him as he took a knee on the red carpet. She started to shake her head, tears threatening to spill over from her eyes. He held one of her small hands in his, and she held the other in front of her mouth.
"Rebecca Reed, we've known each other for years. When we first worked together 5 years ago, the connection we had then was undeniable. We've worked together again recently, and our connection rekindled. Even better, you've opened my eyes, Rebecca. You've taught me how to see what's right in front of me in a different light instead of always just accepting things at face value. I love you, Rebecca. I suspect I always have. I would be honored if you would continue to stand by my side, helping Sharjah see things through your perspective and find ways to help our people continue to grow. Rebecca Reed, what I'm asking is, will you marry me?"
Tears spilled down her cheeks, and in the moment it took before Rebecca could speak, the moment where Zaid reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, holding it out to her, he began to doubt himself, to doubt his certainty that she would agree to be his wife. "Yes," she cried, and he slid the ring he'd chosen especially for her onto her finger, his heart exploding with joy. "Yes, yes, yes, Zaid, oh my God, yes! I love you so much." She threw her arms around him, hanging off him as he stood up, lifting her a foot or so off the floor while the guests applauded and hooted.
When he finally set Rebecca down, his father stood to cue the music back up. Only, instead of music bursting from the speakers, the doors to the ballroom banged open. Members of the military stormed in, flanking Alakabak, the guests of the ball shrinking away from the men. At Alakabak's signal, 4 soldiers seized Zaid and Rebecca.
"What's the meaning of this?"
boomed the Sultan from where he stood.
"These 2 have been conspiring against you, Sultan,"
Alakabak accused, and whatever joy was left in Zaid's heart turned to bitter anger.
"Now that they've made their alliance official, it's time to expose the truth."
The Sultan looked at Zaid and Rebecca.
"What are you talking about, Alakabak?" he demanded. "The terrorist group that has claimed credit for the attacks on Timina had dealings with Ms. Reed," he accused. "What are you talking about? This is her first time here," Zaid responded, fisting his hands to keep from strangling Alakabak's smug face. "Are you sure about that? Perhaps you should ask her." Whipping his head around to look at Rebecca, he looked at the stricken look on her face, as tears shimmered in her eyes. "Rebecca, what is he talking about?" Zaid asked her, suddenly worried about her response. "My parents. They thought they were doing good helping workers at a factory. They had said that the Sultan had been abusing his power. My father was helping them to organize a strike, but that wasn't what they wanted. When he found out about the bomb-making equipment, he reported it immediately." Rebecca took a shuddering breath. Her eyes grew unfocused as she seemed to remember the event. "They caught us as we were trying to get out of the country. Held guns to my parents' heads. I hid Amy's face so she wouldn't see. I thought for sure we were all going to die. But we didn't. Instead, they branded us as traitors. Even my sister and me. She was so little. Her screams." Before Zaid could console her, Alakabak strode forward and grabbed her right arm. Pushing her sleeve up to expose her upper arm, he held it up for everyone to see. "This is not the brand of a traitor, but one marking her as one of their own. Rebecca Reed is a terrorist. She and Sheikh Zaid orchestrated the attack on the factory in Timina as the first step in a revolt against American interests in Sharjah. Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi has been plotting for months to take out all of the American interests in the area. That is why the diplomatic party who has been touring the region was placed in harm's way during the attack," Alakabak continued. "Is this true, son?" the Sultan asked. "No, sir," Zaid said with a shake of his head. "Absolutely not." "Then what is he going on about?" the Sultan asked again. "I'm talking about your son trying to bring shame and dishonor to your family and to all of Sharjah," the madman continued. "He and his American whore have an illegitimate son as well, conceived during one of his visits to the States when they worked together. In fact, during the bombing of the factory at Timina, his son was supposed to be caught in the explosion and killed to prevent you from ever finding out about him. When the boy wasn't sufficiently injured, one of their cohorts attempted to take him away to kill him, but at the last moment, Sheikh Zaid stopped him." "Is this true?" Rebecca asked. "Was someone trying to take Caleum away?" Zaid froze, remembering that moment. In the rush to find Caleum and Rebecca, he had assumed that the man was merely taking Caleum to safety. He never considered that anyone would attempt to kidnap him in the middle of all that chaos. Nodding his head, he wasn't sure he could speak at that moment. The look of gratitude Rebecca gave him was almost his undoing. "Thank you," she whispered. It hit him then the reason why all of this was happening. He'd ignored too many things. Rebecca had warned him at every turn, but he refused to listen, thinking he knew better. It was time to speak up. If Alakabak gets his way, the people of Rajak and Timina, possibly even all of Sharjah, will suffer, and he wasn't going to let that happen. "We need to get these terrorists out of the Sultan's palace, or we will be at risk for more terror attacks." Alakabak had started talking truly out of his head. His words made less and less sense as he spoke. The soldiers shoved at Zaid and Rebecca to get them to move toward the exit. Zaid shoved back at the nearest soldier, who happily pressed a gun to his back. He waited, knowing that when the time came, he would easily be able to speak out against the accusations against him. Rebecca looked at him.
"Say something," she said. "You know he's wrong." He fought off the hands on his shoulders and moved out of the tight circle the soldiers had created around them. Alakabak turned to stare at him. The soldiers standing behind the madmen pulled their weapons and aimed them at Sheikh Zaid. The room let out a collective gasp. He stood for what felt like forever, his gaze locked on his father's most trusted advisor, the single man closer to the Sultan than any of his sons. The madman's dark eyes bored deeply into his, empty of anything except hatred and greed. They were the deepest black. They tried to pull him in, but he would not be moved. Chapter 15. Adrenaline surged through him as he faced Alakabak. While he never liked the man, he had never suspected the lengths he would go to disrupt the realm, as the final pieces of the puzzle he'd been contemplating fit in place.
"Father," he began, "arrest this man. He is a traitor, a thief, and a terrorist," he said calmly. "I'm sorry?" the Sultan asked. "Have you gone mad, boy?" Alakabak spit his words at Zaid. "Father," Zaid continued, "I have proof that the terror attack was orchestrated by your chief advisor, Alakabak Nuzu." "What?" the Sultan's voice boomed. "In fact, Nuzu has been funding this terror organization with money he has been funneling out of programs intended to revitalize areas like Rajak and Timina," Zaid continued. "At the same time, he has been funneling money out of various programs and depositing it in personal offshore accounts to avoid detection." "Is this true, Alakabak?" the Sultan demanded. "What? Are you really going to take the word of a playboy sheik with a bastard child by one of his American concubines?" "I'll take that as a yes," the Sultan said. "Father," Zaid continued, "I've collected documentation that will show Nuzu has been stealing money for several years now, some of which he has funneled into a terror organization he cleverly labeled a private security group so that no one would notice. A larger portion he transferred to a private bank account that he keeps in his wife's name." Turning to look at Alakabak, "Didn't think I'd realize you used your wife's maiden name, did you?" As the older man hissed at him, Zaid continued relaying the information he had. "It's my suspicion that he had plans to overthrow the Emirate government, while specifically targeting all American targets here in the Emirate of Sharjah in order to make you look bad. I'm of the belief that if he managed to remove all foreign investors, our people will call for a vote of no confidence in you, Father." The Sultan was standing now, fuming. "Arrest this man," he bellowed through the ballroom. Alakabak bolted, running for the door. The soldiers who had followed him in were now approaching him to detain him for the Sultan. "Alakabak Nuzu, in accordance with the law, you will be brought up on charges of terrorism, conspiracy to commit terrorism, money laundering, and anything else the prosecutor sees fit to add after reviewing the facts in your case. For now, these soldiers will remove you from the palace, and you will be remanded into custody until your trial. I can't believe I trusted you for so long. There is no telling how much you have stolen from our people. But this is just the beginning of the full formal investigation I will launch into your actions," the Sultan told him, his voice full of fury. As Alakabak was escorted from the ballroom, Zaid continued his speech. "Father, I do have more to say," Zaid started. Gesturing to Rebecca to come forward, he turned to the other side of the room and gestured to someone else. Rebecca watched as Amy walked toward them, holding Caleum's hand. Holding his hands out, Zaid turned back to his father, holding both Rebecca's and Caleum's hands. "Father, I would like you to meet your grandson, Caleum. Caleum, this is your grandfather." Caleum waved his hand as he gave the Sultan a shy hi before hiding his head behind Zaid's leg. Any anger the Sultan may have felt seemed to evaporate instantly as he walked toward Caleum. Bending down to his eye level, he waited for Caleum to acknowledge him before holding his hand out to shake his hand. "It's very nice to meet you, young man," he told him solemnly, as Caleum smiled. Tightening his hand on Rebecca, he pulled her in front of him. "Father, this is Rebecca Reed, my fiancée." "Ah, the terrorist," the Sultan responded, shaking her hand.
Sighing loudly.
"No, father. Her parents were activists who made the mistake of bringing their daughters to parts of the world they didn't belong, and sometimes the measures they went to could be deemed dangerous, which is why both sisters," he paused, gesturing to Amy, who waved at the Sultan, "were sent to live with an aunt. Rebecca is a humanitarian who often speaks her mind without first thinking about the consequences."
At both Rebecca's and Amy's shocked looks, Zaid shrugged.
"What? Did you think after all the hints you dropped I wouldn't have you investigated?"
The Sultan began to laugh as he looked from one to the other. He still hadn't released Rebecca's hand, and she gently tried to pull her hand away, but he took it in both hands instead.
"Do you love my son, Miss Reed?"
"With all my heart, sir," she answered him, tears starting to shimmer on her eyes again.
"And you, Zaid? You love this woman?" "Yes, sir."
Taking Rebecca's hand, the Sultan placed it in Zaid's. Placing his hands on their shoulders, he stepped closer and kissed first Rebecca and then Zaid.
"Then you have my blessing."
Caleum, who had been watching all this, made an ew sound, which made the Sultan laugh again. Leaning down, he scooped Caleum up in his arms and hugged him.
"My grandson doesn't seem to like kissing,"
he announced to the room as laughter was heard throughout.
"Now, if there's nothing else," the Sultan asked. "Father, if I may, I'd like to address our guests." "Feel free," the Sultan told him. "I apologize for tonight's spectacle," Zaid began. "My fiancée, Rebecca Reed, was the envoy appointed to accompany the delegates with the diplomatic touring party visiting Sharjah. She exposed the poverty in Rajak and Timina to me, and she helped me to see the government forces behind the continued cycle of poverty that persisted despite our best efforts to fund revitalization programs and bring new jobs into the region. But instead of investigating the problems and trying to correct the root issues, we've continued blindly throwing more money into these communities, only to have it stolen right from under our noses."
He paused for a moment to gather his thoughts before continuing.
"What I'm saying is that by working with Rebecca to figure out the real problems in our poorer communities, I have realized that the only way to solve them is to stop hiding them and actually address them. With Rebecca's help, I will continue the work we have started here. There is no legitimate reason why every person in the emirate can't be successful."
He felt a surge of pride as the guests at the ball applauded him. He laughed to himself, because he had done exactly what his brothers before him had. He had taken one event and repurposed it for something entirely different, turning Jazia Ball into a campaign to save all the peoples of Sharjah. He grabbed Rebecca and pulled her to him, embracing her in his arms as he planted his lips on hers in a long, slow, sensual kiss. As the DJ turned the music back up, Zaid heard his father call out,
"Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we're going to have a wedding."
Epilogue. The ballroom was decorated in green and gold, Rebecca's favorite colors. Even the carpet had been changed for the wedding from the usual deep red to the deep green Rebecca had chosen. The round tables were covered in green tablecloths with gold trim, and every seat was taken. This wedding was special since Zaid was the last of the Sultan's sons to marry. In the back of the room, where the procession started down the aisle, Zaid and Rebecca stood like the topper on their own wedding cake. The wedding party walked in front of them, from the wings to the center and down the aisle toward the front. Ahmed and Melanie crossed from either side to join in the middle and walked down the aisle together, followed by Khalid and Casey. Lastly, Caleum and Amy met in the middle and walked down as best man and maid of honor. The groomsmen, including Caleum, all wore traditional white gowns with the black robes over their shoulders like the Sultan wore. The bridesmaids wore plain green floor-length dresses. Their heads were uncovered, which was unconventional, but there wasn't much about Zaid and Rebecca's marriage that was going to be traditional or conventional. In front of the podium stood both an officiant and a priest,
waiting for the bride and groom to start their slow walk down the aisle together. Their arms were twined together as they smiled at their guests. Zaid wore a white gown with his black and gold robe over his shoulders. Rebecca's emerald green dress was decorated with ornate gold embroidery. Her auburn hair was hidden behind a headpiece that covered her head but kept her face uncovered, at Zaid's request. They reached the front of the aisle and stood at the podium hand in hand. Looking down at their hands, he squeezed hers as she smiled at him. From the moment she had said yes, Zaid was sure his heart was that much lighter as he looked at the love shining in her eyes. It was the beginning of their new life, and honestly, for Zaid it felt like they were picking up where they'd left off 5 years ago, where they never should have left off. As he stood there staring into his bride's beautiful eyes, he couldn't help but wonder how things would have gone if he hadn't been the Sheikh of Sharjah. Would they still be getting married? Would they have ever found each other again? He knew that no matter what, he loved her, and he would have loved her no matter their circumstances. But still, he couldn't help but ask himself what their future would have looked like had he been just a normal man instead of a sheikh. She smiled at him as the ceremony began, and he knew that none of his questions or doubts meant anything in front of her. This was their life, and they were going to make the most of it. Together. They recited their vows and exchanged rings, signifying their commitment to each other. Zaid looked back at Caleum at one point and winked at his son. Then the time came. They both answered, "I do," and they were introduced to their guests as Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi and Rebecca Reed al-Qasimi, choosing to keep her last name since Caleum was still a Reed as well. Then Zaid wrapped an arm around the petite waist of his bride and pulled her to him. After the kiss, the ballroom erupted as the guests celebrated and cheered for their union. Her new father-in-law sat on his large throne-like chair and clapped for the newlyweds. They stepped down from the dais to join their guests on the floor of the ballroom. Rebecca found herself surrounded by her new family, a close-knit group that looked after each other and took care of one another unlike anything she'd ever seen before. It was a big family, and she'd always wanted a big family. Maybe not wanted, but she dreamed about it. Rebecca had grown up with her little sister Amy and her parents, who had always been so absorbed with their work that it was as if they were never around. She hadn't even reached out to them to tell them about the marriage. She didn't want them to know that she was marrying into a wealthy, powerful family. If they had known that she was the wife of a sheikh, they would have immediately peppered her with requests for this cause or that one. Instead, she spent the evening with her new husband and family. "You looked so beautiful up there," Casey shouted over the music as the girls were dancing after the wedding. "It's like having a new sister," Melanie told her. "2 new sisters," Casey corrected her, throwing an arm around Amy's neck. There weren't many other people at the wedding who Rebecca knew, so as her husband celebrated with his brothers and other male members of the family, she stuck by her new sisters. There were still so many things to do now that she was married. There was a whole new life ahead of her, and she had to finish sloughing off her old life so that she could move forward. But she knew that her new family would help her where she needed them to. In the meantime, she danced and celebrated the best new beginning she could have imagined. She celebrated finding true love and an opportunity to fight the good fight, all rolled into one. In a place like Sharjah, a place experiencing so much rapid growth, she knew she would be able to do a lot of good as wife to one of the sheikhs. She knew that just as she had shown the royal family what was going on in the streets of the emirate, she would be able to show the citizens of the emirate how hard the royal family tried to work for them. She looked forward to all the good they were going to do together, all the love they would share, and to watching their son grow into a man under the watchful, caring eyes of their wonderful family. It was her dream job, her dream wedding, her dream family, and a dream come true for Rebecca to have married Sheikh Zaid al-Qasimi. As the night ended, they found themselves back on the rooftop terrace again. So many nights had found them under the stars already, and that seemed to be the theme for them. Zaid stood with Rebecca in his arms,
just as he had so many years ago on the balcony behind her hotel room.
"Do you remember this from the first time?"
he asked her. "I do, but I like it this time so much better," she answered him. "Do you know why?" Zaid grinned in the dark.
"No. Why?"
She nestled herself up against him.
"Because now it doesn't have to end,"
she told him, and rested her head on his chest. She was right. It didn't have to stop this time. Nothing was going to pull them away from each other this time. There were no other responsibilities that would come between them ever again. There were no strange career attachments that would pull them apart. They were together now, and it was legitimate this time. They weren't sneaking off in between meetings for quick trysts in public places. They weren't sneaking into each other's rooms at night when no one else was looking. None of that had to happen anymore. And there would be no more mornings that would find one of them waking up alone because the other had to flee what they'd done the night before.
"It doesn't have to stop, ever,"
Zaid repeated.
"I have you now, and I will always have you."
"Yes," she agreed. "That's all I've ever wanted for us. The opportunity to be together for real, instead of finding ways to live out snippets of a fantasy that could have gotten both of us in trouble." Zaid laughed.
"That's ironic, don't you think? When this started, it was a major conflict of interest. Neither one of our jobs would have worked out if people found out at the wrong time that we had been sleeping together."
"But now that we're married," she added, "none of that even matters anymore. It's like we retroactively legitimized everything we ever did together."
"Exactly,"
he agreed, holding her tight. After a few minutes of silence under the vast starry sky, he asked her,
"Are you ready?"
"I've been ready since the first time I saw you," she answered.
"I have been too," he agreed. "I have been too."
She looked up at him, and the starlight sparkled in her eyes. "Then, that settles it," she said. She put a hand around the back of his neck and pulled him down to kiss her. Their lips touched as softly as they had that night on the balcony so many years ago, when they had known that no matter what they promised each other, that last kiss was the last kiss. Though they'd kissed hundreds, perhaps thousands of times since, tonight's kiss felt more like the first kiss, the kiss before all of the others, the sweetest one. Once again, under the dark, starry sky with the moon shining down on the water in the bay behind the palace, they stared deep into each other's eyes, neither one wanting to look away first, neither one wanting to let go.
"This couldn't have all been just a dream," he said to her.
"No, it wasn't," she echoed.
"The only way to find out is if one of us lets go, and it doesn't end," he suggested.
"Then let go," she challenged. Zaid smiled.
"Rebecca, I am never going to let go of you again."
"That works for me." And they kissed again, their lips pressing together in a long, loving embrace. They didn't let go, but not because they were afraid it was a dream. They didn't let go because they wanted the night to last forever this time. This has been The Sheikh's Secret Son, the Sharjah Sheikhs series, Book 3, written by Leslie North, narrated by Nicholas Thurkettle.